Chapter 1, in which Morris suspects how very little does the amateur, dwelling at home at ease, comprehend the labors and perils of the author, and when he smilingly schemes the surface of a work of fiction, how little does he consider the hours of toil, consultation of authorities, researches in the Bodleian, correspondence with learned and illegible Germans. In one word, the vast scaffolding that was first built up and then knocked down to while away an hour for him in a railway train. Thus I might begin this tale with a biography of Tani, birthplace, parentage, genius probably inherited from his mother, remarkable instance of precocity, etc., and a complete treatise on the system to which he bequeathed his name. The material is all beside me in a pigeonhole, but I scorn to appear vainglorious. Tanti is dead, and I never saw anyone who even pretended to regret him. And as for the tontine system, a word will suffice for all the purposes of this unvarnished narrative. A number of sprightly youths, the more the merrier, put up a certain sum of money, which is then funded in a pool under trustees. Coming on for a century later, the proceeds are fluttered for a moment in the face of the last survivor, who is probably deaf, so that he cannot even hear the success, and who is certainly dying, so that he might just as well have lost. The peculiar poetry and even humor of the scheme is now apparent, since it is one by which nobody concerned can possibly profit. But its fine, sportsmanlike character endeared it to our grandparents. When Joseph Finsbury and his brother Masterman were little lads in white frilled trousers, their father, a well-to-do merchant in Cheapside, caused them to join a small but rich tontine of 37 lives. £1,000 was the entrance fee, and Joseph Finsbury can remember to this day the visit to the lawyers, when members of the tontine, all children like himself, were assembled together, and sat in turn in the big office chair, and signed their names with the assistance of a kind old gentleman in spectacles and Wellington boots. He remembers play with the children afterwards on the lawn at the back of the lawyer's house, and a battle royal that he had with a brother tontiner who had kicked his shins. The sound of war called forth the lawyer from where he was dispensing cake and wine to the assembled parents in the office, and the combatants were separated, and Joseph's spirit, for he was the smaller of the two, commended by the gentleman in the Wellington boots, who vowed he had been just such another at the same age. Joseph wondered to himself if he had worn at that time little Wellingtons and a little bald head, and when in bed at night, he grew tired of telling himself stories of sea fights. He used to dress himself up as the old gentleman and entertain other little boys and girls with cake and wine. In the year 1840, the 37 were all alive. In 1850, their number had decreased by 6. In 1856 and 1857, business was more lively, for the Crimea and the mutiny carried off no less than 9. There remain in 1870 but 5 of the original members, and at the date of my story, including the 2 Finsburys, but 3. By this time, Masterman was in his 73rd year. He had long complained of the effects of age, had long since retired from business, and now lived in absolute seclusion under the roof of his son Michael, the well-known solicitor. Joseph, on the other hand, was still up and about, and still presented but a semi-venerable figure on the streets in which he loved to wander. This was the more to be deplored because Masterman had led, even to the least particular, a model British life. Industry, regularity, respectability, and a preference of 4% are understood to be the very foundations of a green old age. All these Mastermen had eminently displayed, and here he was a Bajendo at 73, while Joseph, barely 2 years younger and the most excellent preservation, had disgraced himself through life by idleness and eccentricity. Embarked in the leather trade, he had early wearied of business, for which he was supposed to have small parts. A taste for general information, not promptly checked, had soon begun to sap his manhood. There is no passion more debilitating to the mind, unless, perhaps, it be that of public speaking which it not infrequently accompanies or begets. The two were conjoined in the case of Joseph. The acute stage of this double malady, that in which the patient delivers gratuitous lectures, soon declared itself with severity, and not many years had passed over his head before he had traveled 30 miles to address an infant school. He was no student. His reading was confined to elementary textbooks and the daily papers. He did not even fly as high as encyclopedias. Life, he would say, was his volume. His lectures were not meant, he would declare, for college professors. They were addressed direct to the great heart of the people, and the heart of the people must certainly be sounder than its head, for his lucubrations were received with favor. that, entitled How to Live Cheerfully on 40 Pounds a Year, created a sensation among the unemployed. Education, its aims, objects, purposes, and desirability, gained in the respect of the shallow-minded. As for his celebrated essay on life insurance regarded in its relation to the masses, read before the Working Men's Mutual Improvement Society, Isle of Dogs, it was received with a literal ovation by an unintelligent audience of both sexes, and so marked was the effect that he was next year elected honorary president of the institution, an office of less than no emolument, since the holder was expected to come down with a donation, but one which highly satisfied his self-esteem. While Joseph was thus building himself up a reputation among the more cultivated portion of the ignorant, his domestic life was suddenly overwhelmed by orphans. The death of his younger brother Jacob saddled him with the charge of two boys, Morris and John, and in the course of the same year his family was still further swelled by the addition of a little girl, the daughter of John Henry Hazeltine, Esq., a gentleman of small property and fewer friends. He had met Joseph only once, at a lecture hall in Holloway, but from that formative experience he returned home to make a new will and consign his daughter and her fortune to the lecturer. Joseph had a kindly disposition, and yet it was not without reluctance that he accepted this new responsibility, advertised for a nurse, and purchased a second-hand perambulator. Morris and John he made more readily welcome, not so much because of the tie of consanguinity as because the leather business, in which he hastened to invest their fortune of £30,000, had recently exhibited inexplicable symptoms of decline. A young but capable Scot was chosen as manager to the enterprise, and the cares of business never again afflicted Joseph Finsbury. Leaving his charges in the hands of the capable Scot, who was married, he began his extensive travels on the continent and in Asia Minor. With a polyglot testament in one hand and a phrase book in the other, he groped his way among the speakers of 11 European languages. The first of these guides is hardly applicable to the purposes of the philosophic traveler, and even the second is designed more expressly for the tourist than for the expert in life. But he pressed interpreters into his service, whenever he could get their services for nothing, and by one means and another filled many notebooks with the results of his researches. In these wanderings he spent several years, and only returned to England when the increasing age of his charges needed his attention. The two lads had been placed in a good but economical school, where they had received a sound commercial education, which was somewhat awkward, as the leather business was by no means in a state to court inquiry. In fact, when Joseph went over his accounts preparatory to surrendering his trust, he was dismayed to discover that his brother's fortune had not increased by his stewardship. Even by making over to his two wards every penny he had in the world, there would still be a deficit of £7,800. When these facts were communicated to the two brothers in the presence of a lawyer, Morris Finsbury threatened his uncle with all the terrors of the law, and was only prevented from taking extreme steps by the advice of the professional man. You cannot get blood from a stone, observed the lawyer, and Morris saw the point and came to terms with his uncle. On the one side, Joseph gave up all that he possessed and assigned his nephew's contingent interest in the tontine, already quite a hopeful speculation. On the other, Morris agreed to harbor his uncle and Miss Hazeltine, who had come to grief with the rest, and to pay to each of them £1 a month as pocket money. The allowance was amply sufficient for the old man. It scarce appears how Miss Hazeltine contrived to dress upon it, but she did, and what is more, she never complained. She was, indeed, sincerely attached to her incompetent guardian. He had never been unkind. His age spoke for him loudly. There was something appealing in his whole-souled quest of knowledge and innocent delight in the smallest mark of admiration, and though the lawyer had warned her she was being sacrificed, Julia had refused to add to the perplexities of Uncle Joseph. In a large, dreary house in John Street, Bloomsbury, these four dwelt together, a family in appearance, in reality a financial association. Julia and Uncle Joseph were, of course, slaves. John, a gentleman with a taste of the banjo, the music hall, the Gaiety Bar, and the sporting papers, must have been anywhere a secondary figure, and the cares and delights of empire devolved entirely upon Morris. That these are inextricably intermixed is one of the commonplaces with which the bland essayist consoles the incompetent and the obscure, but in the case of Morris the bitter must have largely outweighed the sweet. He grudged no trouble to himself. He spared none to others. He called the servants in the morning. He served out the stores with his own hand. He took soundings of the sherry. He numbered the remainder biscuits. Painful scenes took place over the weekly bills, and the cook was frequently impeached, and the tradespeople came and hectored with him in the back parlor upon a question of 3 farthings. The superficial might have deemed him a miser. In his own eyes, he was simply a man who had been defrauded. The world owed him £7,800, and he intended that the world should pay. But it was in his dealings with Joseph that Morris's character particularly shone. His uncle was a rather gambling stock in which he had invested heavily, and he spared no pains in nursing the security. The old man was seen monthly by a physician, whether he was well or ill. His diet, his raiment, his occasional outings, now to Brighton, now to Bournemouth, were doled out to him like pap to infants. In bad weather, he must keep the house. In good weather, by 9:30, he must be ready in the hall. Morris would see that his gloves and that his shoes were sound, and the pair would start for the leather business arm in arm. The way there was probably dreary enough, for there was no pretense of friendly feeling. Morris had never ceased to upbraid his guardian with his defalcation, and to lament the burden of Miss Hazeltine. And Joseph, though he was a mild enough soul, regarded his nephew with something very near akin to hatred. But the way there was nothing to the journey back. For the mere sight of the place of business, as well as every detail of his transactions, was enough to poison life for any Finsbury. Joseph's name was still over the door. It was he who still signed the checks. But this was only policy on the part of Morris, and designed to discourage other members of the tontine. In reality, the business was entirely his, and he found it an inheritance of sorrows. He tried to sell it, and the offers he received were quite derisory. He tried to extend it, and it was only the liabilities he succeeded in extending. To restrict it, and it was only the profits he managed to restrict. Nobody had ever made money out of that concern except the capable Scot, who retired, after his discharge, to the neighborhood of Banff and built a castle with his profits. The memory of this fallacious Caledonian Morris would revile daily as he sat in the private office opening his mail, with old Joseph at another table, sullenly awaiting orders, or savagely affixing signatures to he knew not what. And when the man of the heather pushed cynicism so far as to send in the announcement of his second marriage to Davida, eldest daughter of the Rev. Alexander McCraw, it was really supposed that Morris would have had a fit. Business hours in the Finsbury leather trade had been cut to the quick. Even Morris's strong sense of duty to himself was not strong enough to dally within those walls and under the shadow of that bankruptcy, and presently the manager and the clerks would draw a long breath and compose themselves for another day of procrastination. Raw haste, on the authority of my Lord Tennyson, is half-sister to delay, but the business habits are certainly her uncle's. Meanwhile, the leather merchant would lead his living investment back to John Street like a puppy dog, and, having there immured in the hall, would depart for the day on the quest of seal rings, the only passion of his life. Joseph had more than the vanity of man. He had that of lecturers. He owned he was in fault, although more sinned against by the capable Scot than sinning. But had he steeped his hands in gore, he would still not deserve to be thus dragged at the chariot wheels of a young man, to sit a captive in the halls of his own leather business, to be entertained with mortifying comments on his whole career, to have his costume examined, his collar pulled up, the presence of his mittens verified, and to be taken out and brought home in custody, like an infant with a nurse. At the thought of it his soul would swell with venom, and he would make haste to hang up his hat and coat and the detested mittens, and slink upstairs to Julia and his notebooks. The drawing-room at least was sacred for Morris. It belonged to the old man and the young girl. It was there that she made her dresses. It was there that he inked his spectacles over the registration of disconnected facts and the calculation of insignificant statistics. Here he would sometimes lament his connection with the tontine. If it were not for that, he cried one afternoon, he would not care to keep me. I might be a free man, Julia, and I could so easily support myself by giving lectures. To be sure you could, said she, and I think it one of the meanest things he ever did to deprive you of that amusement. There were those nice people at the Isle of Cats, wasn't it, who wrote and asked you so very kindly to give them an address. I did think he might have let you go to the Isle of Cats. He is a man of no intelligence, cried Joseph. He lives here literally surrounded by the absorbing spectacle of life, and for all the good it does him, he might just as well be in his coffin. Think of his opportunities. The heart of any other young man would burn within him at the chance. The amount of information that I have it in my power to convey, if you would only listen, is a thing that beggars language, Julia." "Whatever you do, my dear, you mustn't excite yourself," said Julia. "For you know, if you look at all ill, the doctor will be sent for." "That is very true," returned the old man humbly. "I will compose myself with a little study." He thumbed his gallery of notebooks. "I wonder," he said, "I wonder, since I see your hands are occupied, whether it might not interest you." "Why, of course it would," cried Julia. "Read me one of your nice stories, there's a dear." He had the volume down and his spectacles upon his nose instanter, as though to forestall some possible retractation. "What I propose to read to you," said he, skimming to the pages, "is the notes of a highly important conversation with a Dutch courier of the name of David Abbas, which is a Latin for abbot. Its results are well worth the money it cost me, for, as Abbas at first appeared somewhat impatient, I was induced to what is, I believe, singularly called stand and drink. It runs only to about 25 pages. Yes, here it is." He cleared his throat and began to read. Mr. Finsbury, according to his own report, contributed about 499/500 to the interview and elicited from Abbas literally nothing. It was dull for Julia, who did not require to listen. For the Dutch courier, who had to answer, it must have been a perfect nightmare. It would seem as if he consoled himself by frequent appliances to the bottle. It would even seem that toward the end, he had ceased to depend on Joseph's frugal generosity and called for the flagon on his own account. The effect, at least, of some mellowing influence was visible in the record. Abbas became suddenly a willing witness. He began to volunteer disclosures, and Julia had just looked up from her scene with something like a smile, when Morris burst into the house, eagerly calling for his uncle, and the next instant plunged into the room, waving in the air the evening paper. It was indeed with great news that he came charged. The demise was announced of Lieutenant General Sir Glasgow Bigger, KCSI, KCMG, etc., and the prize of the tontine now lay between the Finsbury brothers. Here was Morris's opportunity at last. The brothers had never, it is true, been cordial. When word came that Joseph was in Asia Minor, Masterman had expressed himself with irritation. "I call it simply indecent," he had said. "Mark my words. We shall hear of him next at the North Pole." And these bitter expressions had been reported to the traveler on his return. What was worse, Masterman had refused to attend a lecture on education, its aims, objects, purposes, and desirability, although invited to platform. Since then the brothers had not met. On the other hand, they never had openly quarreled. Joseph, by Morris's orders, was prepared to waive the advantage of his juniority. Masterman had enjoyed all through life the reputation of a man neither greedy nor unfair. Here, then, were all the elements of compromise assembled, and Morris, suddenly beholding his £7,800 restored to him, and himself dismissed from the vicissitudes of the leather trade, hastened the next morning to the office of his cousin Michael. Michael was something of a public character. Launched upon the law at a very early age and quite without protectors, he had become a trafficker in shady affairs. He was known to be the man for a lost cause. It was known he could extract testimony from a stone and interest from a gold mine, and his office was besieged in consequence by all that numerous class of persons who had still some reputation to lose, and find themselves upon the point of losing it, by those who had made undesirable acquaintances, who had mislaid a compromising correspondence, or who are blackmailed by their own butlers. In private life, Michael was a man of pleasure, but it was thought his dire experience of the office had gone far to sober him, and it was known that, in the matter of investments, he preferred the solid to the brilliant. What was yet more to the purpose, he had been all his life a consistent scoffer at the Finsbury tontine. It was therefore with little fear for the result that Morris presented himself before his cousin, and proceeded feverishly to set forth a scheme. For near upon a quarter of an hour the lawyer suffered him to dwell upon its manifest advantages uninterrupted. Then Michael rose from his seat, and, ringing for his clerk, uttered a single clause. "It won't do, Morris." It was in vain that the leather merchant pleaded and reasoned, and returned day after day to plead and reason. It was in vain that he offered a bonus of 1,000, of 2,000, of 3,000 pounds. In vain that he offered in Joseph's name to be content with only 1/3 of the pool. Still there came the same answer. "It won't do. I can't see the bottom of this." he said at last. "You answer none of my arguments. You haven't a word to say. For my part, I believe it's malice." The lawyer smiled at him benignly. "You may believe one thing," said he. "Whatever else I do, I am not going to gratify any of your curiosity. You see, I am a trifle more communicative today, because this is our last interview upon the subject." "Our last interview," cried Morris. "The stirrup cup, dear boy," returned Michael. "I can't have my business hours encroached upon. And by the by, have you no business of your own? Are there no convulsions in the leather trade?" "I believe it to be malice," repeated Morris doggedly. "You always hated and despised me from a boy." No, not hated," returned Michael soothingly. "I rather like you than otherwise. There's such a permanent surprise about you. You look so dark and attractive from a distance. Do you know that to the naked eye you look romantic, like what they call a man with a history? And indeed, from all that I can hear, the history of the leather trade is full of incident." "Yes," said Morris, disregarding these remarks. "It's no use coming here. I shall see your father." "Oh, no, you won't," said Michael. "Nobody shall see my father." "I should like to know why," cried his cousin. "I never make any secret of that," replied the lawyer. "He is too ill." "If he is as ill as you say," cried the other, "the more reason for accepting my proposal. I will see him." "Will you?" said Michael, and he rose and rang for his clerk. It was now time, according to Sir Faraday Bond, the medical baronet whose name is so familiar at the foot of bulletins, that Joseph, the poor golden goose, should be removed into the purer air of Bournemouth, and for that uncharted wilderness of villas the family now shook off the dust of Bloomsbury. Julia delighted, because at Bournemouth she sometimes made acquaintances. John in despair, for he was a man of city tastes. Joseph indifferent where he was, so long as there was pen and ink and daily papers, and he could avoid martyrdom at the office. Morris himself, perhaps, not displeased to permit these visits to the city, and have a quiet time for thought. He was prepared for any sacrifice. All he desired was to get his money again and clear his feet of leather. And it would be strange, since he was so modest in his desires, and the pool amounted to upward £116,000. It would be strange indeed if he could find no way of influencing Michael. "If I could only guess his reason," he repeated to himself, and by day, as he walked in Branksome Woods, and by night, as he turned upon his bed, and at meal times, when he forgot to eat, and in the bathing machine, when he forgot to dress himself, that problem was constantly before him. Why had Michael refused? At last, one night, he burst into his brother's room and woke him. "What's all this?" asked John. "Julia leaves this place tomorrow," replied Morris. "She must go up to town and get the house ready and find servants. We shall all follow in 3 days." "Oh, bravo!" cried John. "But why?" "I've found it out, John," returned his brother gently. "It? What?" inquired John. "Why Michael won't compromise," said Morris. "It's because he can't. It's because Masterman's dead, and he's keeping it dark." "Golly!" cried the impressionable John. "But what's the use? Why does he do it, anyway?" "To defraud us of the tontine," said his brother. "He couldn't." "You have to have a doctor's certificate," objected John. "Did you never hear of venal doctors?" inquired Morris. "They're as common as blackberries. You can pick 'em up for £3.10 a head." "I wouldn't do it under 50 if I were Sawbones," ejaculated John. "And then Michael," continued Morris, "is in the very thick of it. All his clients have come to grief. His whole business is rotten eggs. If any man could arrange it, he could. And depend upon it, he has his plan all straight. And depend upon it, it's a good one, for he's clever and be damned to him. But I'm clever too, and I'm desperate. I lost £7,800 when I was an orphan at school." "Oh, don't be tedious," interrupted John. "You've lost far more already. Try and get it back." Chapter 2, in which Morris takes action. Some days later, accordingly, the 3 males of this depressing family might have been observed by a reader of G.P.R. James, taking their departure from the East Station of Bournemouth. The weather was raw and changeable, and Joseph was arrayed in consequence according to the principles of Sir Faraday Bond, a man no less strict, as is well known, on costume than on diet. There are few polite invalids who have not lived or tried to live by that punctilious physician's orders. Avoid tea, madam. The reader has doubtless heard him say, avoid tea, fried liver, anemono wine, and baker's bread. Retire nightly at 10.45, and clothe yourself, if you please, throughout in hygienic flannel. Externally, the fur of the marten is indicated. Do not forget to procure a pair of health boots at Messrs. Dale and Crumby's. And he has probably called you back, even after you have paid your fee, to add with stentorian emphasis, I've forgotten one caution. Avoid kippered sturgeon as you would the very devil. The unfortunate Joseph was cut to the pattern of Sir Faraday in every button. He was shod with a health boot. His suit was of genuine ventilating cloth. His shirt of hygienic flannel, a somewhat dingy fabric. And he was draped at the knees in an inevitable greatcoat of marten's fur. The very railway porters at Bournemouth, which was a favorite station of the doctor's, marked the old gentleman for a creature of Sir Faraday. There was but one evidence of personal taste, a visored forage cap, from this former headpiece, since he had fled from a dying jackal on the plains of Ephesus, and weathered a boar in the Adriatic. Nothing could divorce our traveler. The three Finsburys mounted into their compartment, and fell immediately to quarreling, a step unseemly in itself and, in this case, highly unfortunate for Morris. Had he lingered a moment longer by the window, this tale need never have been written, for he might then have observed, as the porters did not fail to do, the arrival of a second passenger in the uniform of Sir Faraday Bond. But he had other matters on hand, which he judged, God knows how erroneously, to be more important. I never heard of such a thing, he cried, resuming a discussion which had scarcely ceased all morning. The bill is not yours, it is mine. It is payable to me, returned the old gentleman, with an air of bitter obstinacy. I will do what I please with my own property. The bill was one for £800, which had been given him at breakfast to endorse, and which he had simply pocketed. Hear him, Johnny, cried Morris. His property, the very clothes upon his back, belonged to me. Let him alone, said John. I am sick of both of you. That is no way to speak of your uncle, sir, cried Joseph. I will not endure this disrespect. You are a pair of exceedingly forward, impudent, and ignorant young men, and I have quite made up my mind to put an end to the whole business. Oh, Skittles, said the graceful John. But Morris was not so easy in his mind. This unusual act of insubordination had already troubled him, and these mutinous words now sounded ominously in his ears. He looked at the old gentleman uneasily. Upon one occasion, many years before, when Joseph was delivering a lecture, the audience had revolted in a body. Finding their entertainer somewhat dry, they had taken the question of amusement into their own hands, and the lecturer, along with the board schoolmaster, the Baptist clergyman, and a working man's candidate, who made up his bodyguard, was ultimately driven from the scene. Morris had not been present on that fatal day. If he had, he would have recognized a certain fighting glitter in his uncle's eye and a certain chewing movement of his lips as old acquaintances. But even to the inexpert, these symptoms breathed of something dangerous. Well, well, said Morris, I have no wish to bother you further till we get to London. Joseph did not so much as look at him in answer. With tremulous hands, he produced a copy of the British Mechanic and ostentatiously buried himself in its perusal. I wonder what could make him so cantankerous, reflected the nephew. I don't like the look of it at all. And he dubiously scratched his nose. The train traveled forth into the world, bearing along with it the customary freight of obliterated voyagers, and along with these old Joseph, affecting immersion in his paper, and John slumbering over the columns of the Pink Un, and Morris revolving in his mind a dozen grudges and suspicions and alarms. It passed Christchurch by the sea, Herne with its pine woods, Ringwood on its mazy river, a little behind time, but not much to the southwestern. It drew up at the platform of the station, in the midst of the New Forest, the real name of which, in case the railway company might have the law of me, I shall veil under the alias of Browndean. Many passengers put their heads to the window, and among the rest an old gentleman on whom I willingly dwell. For I am nearly done with him now, and in the whole course of the present narrative, I am not in the least likely to meet another character so decent. His name is immaterial, not so his habits. He had passed his life wandering in a tweed suit on the continent of Europe, and years of Galignani's messenger having at length undermined his eyesight, he suddenly remembered the rivers of Assyria and came to London to consult an oculist. From the oculist to the dentist, and from both to the physician, the step appears inevitable. Presently he was in the hands of Sir Faraday, robed in ventilating cloth and sent to Bournemouth, and to that domineering baronet, who was his only friend upon his native soil, he was now returning to report. The case of these tweed-suited wanderers is unique. We have all seen them entering the table d'hote at Spezia or Graz or Venice, with a genteel melancholy and a faint appearance of having been to India and not succeeded. In the offices of many hundred hotels they are known by name, and yet, if the whole of this wandering cohort would disappear tomorrow, their absence would be wholly unremarked. How much more, if only one, say this one in the ventilating cloth, should vanish. He had paid his bills at Bournemouth. His worldly effects were all in a van in 2 portmanteaus, and these, after proper interval, would be sold as unclaimed baggage to a Jew. Sir Faraday's butler would be a half-crown poorer at the year's end, and the hotel keepers of Europe about the same date will be mourning a small but quite observable decline in profits. And that would be literally all. Perhaps the old gentleman thought something of the sort, for he looked melancholy enough as he pulled his bare, gray head back into the carriage, and the train smoked under the bridge and forth, with ever-quickening speed, across the mingled heaths and woods of the New Forest. Not many hundred yards beyond Browndean, however, a sudden jarring of brakes set everybody's teeth on edge, and there was a brutal stoppage. Morris Finsbury was aware of a confused uproar of voices, and sprang to the window. Women were screaming. Men were tumbling from the windows on the track. The guard was crying to them to stay where they were. At the same time, the train began to gather way and move very slowly backward toward Browndean, and the next moment, all these various sounds were blotted out in an apocalyptic whistle and the thundering onslaught of the down express. The actual collision Morris did not hear. Perhaps he fainted. He had a wild dream of having seen the carriage double up and fall to pieces like a pantomime trick, and sure enough, when he came to himself, he was lying on the bare earth and under the open sky. His head ached savagely. He carried his hand to his brow, and was not surprised to see it red with blood. The air was filled with an intolerable, throbbing roar, which he expected to find die away with the return of consciousness, and instead of that it seemed but to swell the louder and to pierce the more cruelly through his ears. It was a raging, bellowing thunder, like a boiler riveting factory. And now curiosity began to stir, and he sat up and looked about him. The track at this point ran in a sharp curve about a wooded hillock. All the near side was heaped with the wreckage of the Bournemouth train. That of the express was mostly hidden by the trees, and just at the turn, under clouds of vomiting steam and piled about with cairns of living coal, lay what remained of the 2 engines, one upon the other. On the heath and margin of the line were many people running to and fro, and cry aloud as they ran, and many others lying motionless like sleeping tramps. Morris suddenly drew an inference. There has been an accident, thought he, and was elated at his perspicacity. Almost at the same time his eye lighted on John, who lay close by as white as paper. Poor old John. Poor old cove, he thought, the schoolboy expression popping forth from some forgotten treasury, and he took his brother's hand in his with childish tenderness. It was perhaps the touch that recalled him. At least John opened his eyes, sat suddenly up, and after several ineffectual movements of his lips, "What's the row?" said he, in a phantom voice. The din of that devil's smithy still thundered in their ears. "Let's get away from that," Morris cried, and pointed to the vomit of steam that still spouted from the broken engines. And the pair helped each other up, and stood and quaked and wavered, and stared about them at the scene of death. Just then they were approached by a party of men, who had already organized themselves for the purposes of rescue. "Are you hurt?" cried one of these, a young fellow with the sweat streaming down his pallid face, and who, by the way he was treated, was evidently the doctor. Morris shook his head, and the young man, nodding grimly, handed him a bottle of some spirit. "Take a drink of that," he said. "Your friend looks as if he needed it badly. We want every man we can get," he added. "There's terrible work before us, and nobody should shirk. If you can do no more, you can carry a stretcher." The doctor was hardly gone before Morris, under the spur of the dram, awoke to the full possession of his wits. "My God!" he cried. "Uncle Joseph!" "Yes," said John. "Where can he be?" "He can't be far off. I hope the old party isn't damaged." "Come and help me to look," said Morris. with a snap of savage determination strangely foreign to his ordinary bearing. And then, for one moment, he broke forth. "If he's dead!" he cried, and shook his fist at heaven. To and fro the brothers hurried, staring in the faces of the wounded or turning the dead upon their backs. They must have thus examined 40 people, and still there was no word of Uncle Joseph. But now the course of their search brought them near the center of the collision, where the boilers were still blowing off steam with a deafening clamor. It was a part of the field not yet gleaned by the rescuing party. The ground, especially on the margin of the wood, was full of inequalities. Here a pit, there a hillock surmounted with a bush of firs. It was a place where many bodies might lie concealed, and they beat it like pointers after game. Suddenly Morris, who was leading, paused and reached forth his index with a tragic gesture. John followed the direction of his brother's hand. In the bottom of a sandy hole lay something that had once been human. The face had suffered severely, and it was unrecognizable, but that was not required. The snowy hair, the coat of marten, the ventilating cloth, the hygienic flannel, everything down to the health boots from Messrs. Dale and Crumby's identified the body as that of Uncle Joseph. Only the forage cap must have been lost in the convulsion, for the dead man was bareheaded. "The poor old beggar," said John, with a touch of natural feeling. "I would give 10 pounds if we hadn't chivied him in the train." But there was no sentiment in the face of Morris as he gazed upon the dead. Gnawing his nails with introverted eyes, his brow marked with the stamp of tragic indignation and tragic intellectual effort, he stood there silent. Here was a last injustice. He had been robbed while he was an orphan at school. He had been lashed to a decadent leather business. He had been saddled with Miss Hazeltine. His cousin had been defrauding him of the tontine, and had borne all this, we might almost say, with dignity, and now they had gone and killed his uncle. "Here," he said suddenly, "take his heels. We must get him into the woods. I'm not going to have anybody find this." "Oh, fudge," said John. "Where's the use?" "Do what I tell you," spurt Morris, as he took the corpse by the shoulders. "Am I to carry him myself?" They were close upon the borders of the wood. In 10 or 12 paces they were under cover, and a little further back, in a sandy clearing of the trees, they laid their burthen down and stood and looked at it with loathing. "What do you mean to do?" whispered John. "Bury him, to be sure," responded Morris, and he opened his pocket knife and began feverishly to dig. "You'll never make a hand of it with that," objected the other. "If you won't help me, you cowardly shirk," screamed Morris. "You can go to the devil." "It's the childishest folly," said John, "but no man shall call me a coward." And he began to help his brother grudgingly. The soil was sandy and light, but matted with the roots of surrounding firs. Gorse tore their hands, and as they baled the sand from the grave, it was often discolored with their blood. An hour passed of unremitting energy upon the part of Morris, of lukewarm help on that of John, and still the trench was barely 9 inches in depth. Into this the body was rudely flung. Sand was piled upon it, and then more sand must be dug, and gorse had to be cut to pile on that. And still from one end of the sordid mound a pair of feet projected and caught the light upon their patent leather toes. But by this time the nerves of both were shaken. Even Morris had enough of his grisly task, and they skulked off like animals into the thickest of the neighboring covert. "It's the best that we can do," said Morris, sitting down. "And now," said John, "perhaps you'll have politeness to tell me what it's all about." "Upon my word," cried Morris, "if you do not understand for yourself, I almost despair of telling you." "Oh, of course it's some rot about the tontine," returned the other, "but it's the merest nonsense. We've lost it, and there's an end." "I tell you," said Morris, "Uncle Masterman is dead. I know it. There's a voice that tells me so." "Well, and so is Uncle Joseph," said John. "He's not dead unless I choose," returned Morris. "And come to that," cried John. "If you're right, and Uncle Masterman's been dead ever so long, all we have to do is to tell the truth and expose Michael." "You seem to think Michael is a fool," sneered Morris. "Can't you understand he's been preparing this fraud for years? He has the whole thing ready. The nurse, the doctor, the undertaker, all bought, the certificate all ready, but the date. Let him get wind of this business, and you mark my words, Uncle Masterman will die in 2 days and be buried in a week. But see here, Johnny, What Michael can do, I can do. If he plays a game of bluff, so can I. If his father is to live forever, by God, so shall my uncle. It's illegal, ain't it? Said John. A man must have some moral courage, replied Morris with dignity. And then suppose you're wrong? Suppose Uncle Masterman's alive and kicking? Well, even then, responded Plotter, we are no worse off than we were before. In fact, we're better. Uncle Masterman must die some day. As long as Uncle Joseph was alive, he might have died any day. But we're out of all that trouble now. There's no sort of limit to the game that I propose. It can be kept up till kingdom come. If I could only see how you meant to set about it, sighed John. But you know, Morris, you always were such a bungler. I'd like to know what I ever bungled, cried Morris. I have the best collection of signet rings in London. Well, you know, there's the leather business, suggested the other. That's considered rather a hash. It was a mark of singular self-control in Morris that he suffered this to pass unchallenged and even unresented. About the business in hand, said he. Once we can get him up to Bloomsbury, there's no sort of trouble. We bury him in the cellar, which seems made for it. And then all I have to do is to start out and find a venal doctor. Why can't we leave him where he is? Asked John. Because we know nothing about the country, retorted Morris. This would maybe a regular lover's walk. Turn your mind to the real difficulty. How are we to get him up to Bloomsbury? Various schemes were mooted and rejected. The railway station at Browndean was, of course, out of the question, for it would now be a center of curiosity and gossip, and of all things, they would be least able to dispatch a dead body without remark. John feebly proposed getting an ale cask and sending it as beer, but the objections to this course were so overwhelming that Morris scorned to answer. The purchase of a packing case seemed equally hopeless, for why should two gentlemen without baggage of any kind require a packing case? They would be more likely to require clean linen. We are working on wrong lines, cried Morris at last. The thing must be gone about more carefully. Suppose now, he added excitedly, speaking by fits and starts, as if he were thinking aloud, suppose we rent a cottage by the month. A householder can buy a packing case without remark. Then suppose we clear the people out today, get the packing case tonight, and tomorrow I hire a carriage or a cart that we could drive ourselves and take the box, or whatever we get, to Ringwood or Lyndhurst or somewhere. We could label it specimens. Don't you see? Johnny, I believe I've hit the nail at last. Well, it sounds more feasible, admitted John. Of course we must take assumed names, continued Morris. It would never do to keep our own. What do you say to Masterman itself? It sounds quiet and dignified. I will not take the name of Masterman, returned his brother. You may, if you like. I shall call myself Vance, the great Vance. Positively, the last 6 nights. There's some go in a name like that. Vance, cried Morris. Do you think we are playing a pantomime for our amusement? There was never anybody named Vance who wasn't a music hall singer. That's the beauty of it, returned John. It gives you some standing at once. You may call yourself Fortescue till all's blue and nobody cares, but to be Vance gives a man a natural nobility. But there's lots of other theatrical names, cried Morris. Laybourne, Irving, Brough, Toole. Devil one will I take, returned his brother. I'm going to have my little lark out of this, as well as you. Very well, said Morris, who perceived that John was determined to carry his point. I shall be Robert Vance. And I shall be George Vance, cried John, the only original George Vance. Rally round the only original. Repairing as well as they were able to disorder their clothes, the Finsbury brothers returned to Browndean by a circuitous route in quest of luncheon and a suitable cottage. It is not always easy to drop at a moment's notice on a furnished residence in a retired locality, but fortune presently introduced our adventurers to a deaf carpenter, a man rich in cottages of the required description and unaffectedly eager to supply their wants. The second place they visited, standing, as it did, about 1.5 miles from any neighbors, caused them to exchange a glance of hope. On a nearer view, the place was not without depressing features. It stood in a marshy-looking hollow of a heath. Tall trees obscured its windows. The thatch visibly rotted on the rafters, and the walls were stained with splashes of unwholesome green. The rooms were small, the ceilings low, the furniture merely nominal. A strange chill and a haunting smell of damp pervaded the kitchen, and the bedroom boasted only of one bed. Morris, with a view to cheapening the place, remarked on this defect. "Well," returned the man, "if you can't sleep too abed, you'd better take a villa residence. And then," pursued Morris, "there's no water. How do you get your water?" "We fill that from the spring," replied the carpenter, pointing to a big barrel that stood beside the door. "The spring ain't so very far off, after all. It's easy brought in buckets. There's a bucket there." Morris nudged his brother as they examined the water butt. It was new and very solidly constructed for its office. If anything had been wanted to decide them, this eminently practical barrel would have turned the scale. A bargain was promptly struck, the month's rent was paid upon the nail, and about an hour later the Finsbury brothers might have been observed returning to the blighted cottage, having along with them the key, which was a symbol of their tenancy, a spirit lamp, with which they fondly told themselves they would be able to cook a pork pie of suitable dimensions, and a quart of the worst whiskey in Hampshire. Nor was this all they had effected already, under the plea that they were landscape painters. They had hired for dawn on the morrow a light but solid two-wheel cart, so that when they entered in their new character, they were able to tell themselves that the back of the business was already broken. John proceeded to get tea, while Morris, foraging about the house, was presently delighted by discovering the lid of the water butt upon the kitchen shelf. Here, then, was the packing case complete. In the absence of straw, the blankets, which he himself at least had not the smallest intention of using for their present purpose, would exactly take the place of packing, and Morris, as the difficulties began to vanish from his path, rose almost to the brink of exultation. There was, however, one difficulty not yet faced, one upon which his whole scheme depended. Would John consent to remain alone in the cottage? He had not yet dared to put the question. It was with high good humor that the pair sat down to the deal table and proceeded to fall to on the pork pie. Morris retailed the discovery of the lid, and the great Vance was pleased to applaud by beating on the table with his fork in true music hall style. "That's the dodge," he cried. "I always said a water butt was what you wanted for this business." "Of course," said Morris, thinking this a favorable opportunity to prepare his brother. "Of course you must stay on in this place till I give the word. I'll give out that uncle is resting in the New Forest. It would not do for both of us to appear in London. We could never conceal the absence of the old man." John's jaw dropped. "Oh, come," he cried. "You can stay in this hole yourself." "I won't." The color came into Morris's cheeks. He saw that he must win his brother at any cost. "You must please remember Johnny," he said, "the amount of the tontine. If I succeed, we shall have each 50,000 to place to our bank account, I and nearer 60. But if you fail," returned John, "what then? What'll be the color of our bank account in that case?" "I will pay all expenses," said Morris, with an inward struggle. "You shall lose nothing." "Well," said John with a laugh, "if the excess are yours and half profits mine, I don't mind remaining here for a couple of days." "A couple of days!" cried Morris, who was beginning to get angry and controlled himself with difficulty. "Why? You would do more to win £5 on a horse race." "Perhaps I would," returned the great Vance. "It's the artistic temperament." "This is monstrous," burst out Morris. "I take all risks. I pay all expenses. I divide profits, and you won't take the slightest pains to help me. It's not decent. It's not honest. It's not even kind." "But suppose," objected John, who was considerably impressed by his brother's vehemence, "suppose that Uncle Masterman is alive after all and lives 10 years longer. Must I rot here all that time?" "Of course not," responded Morris, in a more conciliatory tone. "I only ask a month at the outside, and if Uncle Masterman is not dead by that time, you can go abroad." "Go abroad," repeated John eagerly. "Why shouldn't I go at once? Tell him that Joseph and I are seeing life in Paris." "Nonsense," said Morris. "Well, but look here," said John. "It's this house. It's such a pigsty. It's so dreary and damp." "You said yourself that it was damp." "Only to the carpenter," Morris distinguished, "and that was to reduce the rent. But really, you know, now we're in it, I've seen worse." "And what am I to do?" complained the victim. "How can I entertain a friend?" My dear Johnny, if you don't think the tontine worth a little trouble, say so, and I'll give the business up. You're dead certain the figures, I suppose? Asked John. Well, with a deep sigh, send me the pink un and all the comic papers regularly. I'll face the music. As afternoon drew on, the cottage breathed more thrillingly of its native marsh. A creeping chill inhabited its chambers. The fire smoked in a shower of rain, coming up from the channel on a slant of wind, tingled on the window panes. At intervals, when the gloom deepened toward despair, Morris would produce the whiskey bottle, and at first John welcomed the diversion. Not for long. It has been said this spirit was the worst in Hampshire. Only those acquainted with the county can appreciate the force of that superlative, and at length even the great Vance, who was no connoisseur, waved the decoction from his lips. The approach of dusk, feebly combated with a single tallow candle, added a touch of tragedy, and John suddenly stopped whistling through his fingers, an art to the practice of which he had been reduced, and bitterly lamented his concessions. "I can't stay here a month," he cried. "No one could. The thing's nonsense, Morris. The parties that lived in the Bastille would rise against a place like this." With an admirable affectation of indifference, Morris proposed a game of pitch and toss. To what will not the diplomatist condescend? It was John's favorite game, indeed his only game. He had found all the rest too intellectual, and he played it with equal skill and good fortune. To Morris himself, on the other hand, the whole business was detestable. He was a bad pitcher, he had no luck in tossing, and he was one who suffered torments when he lost. But John was in a dangerous humor, and his brother was prepared for any sacrifice. By 7 o'clock, Morris, with incredible agony, had lost a couple of half-crowns. Even with the tontine before his eyes, this was as much as he could bear, and, remarking that he would take his revenge some other time, he proposed a bit of supper and a grog. Before they had made an end of this refreshment, it was time to be at work. A bucket of water for present necessities was withdrawn from the water butt, which was then emptied and rolled before the kitchen fire to dry, and the two brothers set forth on their adventure under a starless heaven. Chapter 3. The Lecturer at Large. Whether mankind is really partial to happiness is an open question. Not a month passes by but some cherished son runs off into the merchant service, or some valued husband decamps to Texas with a lady help. Clergymen have fled from their parishioners, and even judges have been known to retire. To an open mind, it will appear upon the whole less strange that Joseph Finsbury should have been led to entertain ideas of escape. His lot, I think we may say, was not a happy one. My friend, Mr. Morris, with whom I travel up twice or thrice a week from Snaresborough Park, is certainly a gentleman whom I esteem, but he was scarce a model nephew. As for John, he is of course an excellent fellow, but if he was the only link that bound one to a home, I think the most of us would vote for foreign travel. In the case of Joseph, John, if he were a link at all, was not the only one. Endearing bonds had long enchained the old gentleman to Bloomsbury, and by these expressions I do not in the least refer to Julia Hazeltine, of whom, however, he was fond enough, but to that collection of manuscript notebooks in which his life lay buried. That he should ever have made up his mind to separate himself from these collections, and go forth upon the world with no other resources than his memory supplied, is a circumstance highly pathetic in itself, and but little creditable to the wisdom of his nephews. The design, or at least the temptation, was already some months old, and when a bill for £800, payable to himself, was suddenly placed in Joseph's hand, it brought matters to an issue. He retained that bill, which, to one of frugality, meant wealth, and he promised himself to disappear among the crowd at Waterloo, or, if that should prove impossible, to slink out of the house in the course of the evening and melt like a dream into the millions of London. By a peculiar interposition of Providence and railway mismanagement, he had not so long to wait. He was one of the first to come to himself and scramble to his feet after the Brownian catastrophe, and he had no sooner remarked his prostrate nephews than he understood his opportunity and fled. A man of upwards of 70, who has just met with a railway accident, and who is covered besides with the full uniform of Sir Faraday Bond, is not very likely to flee far, but the wood was close at hand, and offered the fugitive at least a temporary covert. Hither, then, the old gentleman skipped with extraordinary expedition, and, being somewhat winded and a good deal shaken, here he lay down in a convenient grove, and was presently overwhelmed by slumber. The way of fate is often highly entertaining to the looker-on, And it is certainly a pleasant circumstance that while Morris and John were delving in the sand to conceal the body of a total stranger, their uncle lay in dreamless sleep a few hundred yards deeper in the wood. He was awakened by the jolly note of a bugle from a neighboring high road, where a char-a-banc was bowling by with some belated tourists. The sound cheered his old heart. It directed his steps into the bargain, and soon he was on the highway, looking east and west from under his visor, and doubtfully revolving what he ought to do. A deliberate sound of wheels arose in the distance, and then a cart was seen approaching, well filled with parcels, driven by a good-natured-looking man on a double bench, and displaying on a board the legend, I. Chandler, Carrier. In the infamously prosaic mind of Mr. Finsbury, certain streaks of poetry survived and were still efficient. They had carried him to Asia Minor as a giddy youth of 40, and now, in the first hours of his recovered freedom, they suggested to him the idea of continuing his flight in Mr. Chandler's cart. It would be cheap, properly broached, it might even cost nothing, and, after years of mittens and hygienic flannel, his heart leaped out to meet the notion of exposure. Mr. Chandler was perhaps a little puzzled to find so old a gentleman, so strangely clothed, and begging for a lift on so retired a roadside. But he was a good-natured man, glad to do a service, and so he took the stranger up, and he had his own idea of civility, and so he asked no questions. Silence, in fact, was quite good enough for Mr. Chandler, but the cart had scarcely begun to move forward ere he found himself involved in a one-sided conversation. "I can see," began Mr. Finsbury, "by the mixture of parcels and boxes that are contained in your cart, each marked with its individual label, and by the good Flemish mare you drive, that you occupy the post of carrier in that great English system of transport which, with all its defects, is the pride of our country." "Yes, sir," returned Mr. Chandler vaguely, for he hardly knew what to reply. "Them parcels post has done us carriers a world of harm." "I am not a prejudiced man," continued Joseph Finsbury. "As a young man, I traveled much. Nothing was too small or too obscure for me to acquire. At sea I studied seamanship, learned the complicated knots employed by mariners, and acquired the technical terms. At Naples, I would learn the art of making macaroni. At Nice, the principles of making candied fruit. I never went to the opera without first buying the book of the piece, and making myself acquainted with the principal airs by picking them out on the piano with one finger." "You must have seen a deal, sir," remarked the carrier, touching up his horse. "I wish I could have had your advantages. Do you know how often the word whip occurs in the Old Testament?" continued the old gentleman. 100 and, if I remember exactly, 47 times. "Do indeed, sir," said Mr. Chandler. "I never should have thought it. The Bible contains 3,501,249 letters. Of verses, I believe there are upward of 18,000. There have been many editions of the Bible. Wycliffe was the first to introduce it into England about the year 1300. The Paragraph Bible, as it is called, is a well-known edition, and is so called because it is divided into paragraphs. The Breeches Bible is another well-known instance, and gets its name either because it was printed by one Breeches, or because the place of publication bore that name. The carrier remarked drily that he thought that was only natural, and turned his attention to more congenial task of passing a cart of hay. It was a matter of some difficulty, for the road was narrow, and there was a ditch on either hand. "I perceive," began Mr. Finsbury, when they had successfully passed the cart, "that you hold your reins with one hand. You should employ two." "Well, I like that," cried the carrier contemptuously. "Why?" "You do not understand," continued Mr. Finsbury. "What I tell you is a scientific fact, and reposes on the theory of the lever, a branch of mechanics. There are some very interesting little shilling books upon the field of study, which I should think a man in your station would take a pleasure to read. But I am afraid you have not cultivated the art of observation. At least we have now driven together for some time, and I cannot remember that you have contributed a single fact. This is a very false principle, my good man. For instance, I do not know if you observed that, as you passed the hay cart man, you took your left?" "Of course I did," cried the carrier, who was now getting belligerent. "He'd have the law on me if I hadn't. In France now," resumed the old man, "and also, I believe, in the United States of America, you would have taken the right." "I would not," cried Mr. Chandler indignantly. "I would have taken the left." I observe again, continued Mr. Finsbury, scorning to reply, that you mend the dilapidated parts of your harness with string. I have always protested against this carelessness and slovenliness of the English poor. In an essay that I once read before an appreciative audience. It ain't string, said the carrier sullenly, its pack thread. I have always protested, resumed the old man, that in their private and domestic life, as well as in their laboring career, the lower classes of this country are improvident, thriftless, and extravagant. A stitch in time. Who the devil are the lower classes? Cried the carrier. You are the lower classes yourself. If I thought you were a blooming aristocrat, I shouldn't have given you a lift. The words were uttered with undisguised ill feeling. It was plain the pair were not congenial, and further conversation, even to one of Mr. Finsbury's pathetic loquacity, was out of the question. With an angry gesture, he pulled down the brim of the forage cap over his eyes, and, producing a notebook and a blue pencil from one of his innermost pockets, soon became absorbed in calculations. On his part, the carrier fell to whistling with fresh zest, and if now and again he glanced at the companion of his drive, it was with mingled feelings of triumph and alarm. Triumph because he had succeeded in arresting that prodigy of speech, and alarm lest by any accident it should begin again. Even the shower, which presently overtook and passed them, was endured by both in silence, and it was still in silence that they drove at length into Southampton. Dusk had fallen. The shop windows glimmered forth into the streets of the old seaport. In private houses lights were kindled for the evening meal, and Mr. Finsbury began to think complacently of his night's lodging. He put his papers by, cleared his throat, and looked doubtfully at Mr. Chandler. "Will you be civil enough," said he, "to recommend me to an inn?" Mr. Chandler pondered for a moment. "Well," he said at last, "I wonder how about the Tregonwell Arms." "The Tregonwell Arms will do very well," returned the old man, "if it's clean and cheap and the people civil." "I wasn't thinking so much of you," returned Mr. Chandler thoughtfully. "I was thinking of my friend keeps the ooze. He's a friend of mine, you see, and he helped me through my trouble last year. And I was thinking, would it be fair like on Watts to saddle him with an old party like you, who might be the death of him with general information? Would it be fair to the ooze?" inquired Mr. Chandler, with an air of candid appeal. "Mark me," cried the old gentleman with spirit. "It was kind in you to bring me here for nothing, but it gives you no right to address me in such terms. Here's a shilling for your trouble, and if you do not choose to set me down at the Tregonwell Arms, I can find it for myself." Chandler was surprised and a little startled. Muttering something apologetic, he returned the shilling, drove in silence through several intricate lanes and small streets, drew up at length before the bright windows of an inn, and called loudly for Mr. Watts. "Is that you, Jem?" cried a hearty voice from the stable yard. "Come in and warm yourself." "I only stopped here," Mr. Chandler explained, "to let down an old gent that wants food and lodging. Mind, I warn you agin him. He's worse nor a temperance lecturer." Mr. Finsbury dismounted with difficulty, for he was cramped with his long drive and the shaking he had received in the accident. The friendly Mr. Watts, in spite of the carter's scarcely agreeable introduction, treated the old gentleman with the utmost courtesy and led him into the back parlor, where there was a big fire burning in the grate. Presently a table was spread in the same room, and he was invited to seat himself before a stewed fowl, somewhat the worse for having seen service before, and a big pewter mug of ale from the tap. He rose from supper a giant refreshed, and, changing his seat to one nearer the fire, began to examine the other guests with an eye to the delights of oratory. There were near a dozen present, all men, and, as Joseph exulted to perceive, all working men. Often already had he seen cause to bless that appetite for disconnected fact and rotatory argument, which has so marked the character of the mechanic. But even an audience of working men has to be courted, and there was no man more deeply versed in the necessary arts than Joseph Finsbury. He placed his glasses on his nose, drew from his pocket a bundle of papers, and spread them before him on a table. He crumpled them. He smoothed them out. Now he skimmed them over, apparently well pleased with their contents. Now, with tapping pencil and contracted brows, he seemed maturely to consider some particular statement. A stealthy glance about the room assured him of the success of his maneuvers. All eyes were turned on the performer. Mouths were open, pipes hung suspended. The birds were charmed. At the same moment, the entrance of Mr. Watts afforded him an opportunity. "I observe," said he, addressing the landlord, but taking at the same time the whole room into his confidence with an encouraging look, "I observe that some of these gentlemen are looking with curiosity in my direction, and certainly it is unusual to see anyone immersed in literary and scientific labors in the public apartment of an inn. I have here some calculations I made this morning upon the cost of living in this and other countries, a subject, I need scarcely say, highly interesting to the working classes. I have calculated a scale of living for incomes of 80, 160, 200, and 240 pounds a year. I must confess that the income of 80 pounds has somewhat baffled me, and the others are not so exact as I could wish. The price of washing varies largely in foreign countries, and the different coals, and firewoods fluctuate surprisingly. I will read my researches, and I hope you won't scruple to point out to me any little errors that I may have committed either from oversight or ignorance. I will begin, gentlemen, with the income of 80 pounds a year." Whereupon the old gentleman, with less compassion than he would have had for brute beasts, delivered himself of all his tedious calculations, as he occasionally gave 9 versions of single income, placing the imaginary person in London, Paris, Baghdad, Spitzbergen, Basora, Heligoland, the Scilly Islands, Brighton, Cincinnati, and Nizhny Novgorod, with an appropriate outfit for each locality. It is no wonder that his hearers look back on that evening as the most tiresome they ever spent. Long before Mr. Finsbury had reached Nizhny Novgorod with the income of 160 pounds, the company had dwindled and faded away to a few old topers and the bored but affable Watts. There was a constant stream of customers from the outer world, but so soon as they were served, they drank their liquor quickly and departed with the utmost celerity for the next public house. By the time the young man with 200 a year was vegetating in the Scilly Islands, Mr. Watts was left alone with the economist, and that imaginary person had scarce commenced life at Brighton before the last of his pursuers desisted from the chase. Mr. Finsbury slept soundly after the manifold fatigues of the day. He rose late, and, after a good breakfast, ordered the bill. Then it was that he made a discovery which has been made by many others, both before and since, that it is one thing to order your bill and another to discharge it. The items were moderate and, what does not always follow, the total small, but after the most sedulous review of all his pockets, 1 and 9 pence halfpenny appeared to be the total of the old gentleman's available assets. He asked to see Mr. Watts. "Here is a bill on London for 800 pounds, said Mr. Finsbury, as that worthy appeared. "I am afraid, unless you choose to discount yourself, it may detain me a day or two till I can get it cashed." Mr. Watts looked at the bill, turned it over, and dog's-eared it with his fingers. "It will keep you a day or two?" he said, repeating the old man's words. "You have no other money with you?" "Some trifling change," responded Joseph. "Nothing to speak of." "Then you can send it me. I should be pleased to trust you." "To tell the truth," answered the old gentleman, "I am more than half inclined to stay. I am in need of funds." "If a loan of 10 shillings would help you, it is at your service," responded Watts with eagerness. "No, I think I would rather stay," said the old man, "and get my bill discounted." "You shall not stay in my house," cried Mr. Watts. "This is the last time you shall have a bed at the Tregonwell Arms." "I insist upon remaining," replied Mr. Finsbury with spirit. "I remain by Act of Parliament. Turn me out if you dare." "Then pay your bill," said Mr. Watts. "Take that," cried the old man, tossing him the negotiable bill. "It is not legal tender," replied Mr. Watts. "You must leave my house at once." "You cannot appreciate the contempt I feel for you, Mr. Watts," said the old gentleman, resigning himself to circumstances. "But you shall feel it in one way. I refuse to pay my bill." "I don't care for your bill," responded Mr. Watts. "What I want is your absence." "That you shall have," said the old gentleman, and, taking up his forage cap as he spoke, he crammed it on his head. "Perhaps you are too insolent," he added, "to inform me of the time of the next London train?" "It leaves in 3/4 of an hour," returned the innkeeper with alacrity. "You can easily catch it." Joseph's position was one of considerable weakness. On the one hand, it would have been well to avoid the direct line of railway, since it was there he might expect his nephews to lie in wait for his recapture. On the other, it was highly desirable, It was even strictly needful to get the bill discounted ere it should be stopped. To London, therefore, he decided to proceed on the first train, and there remained but one point to be considered: how to pay his fare. Joseph's nails were never clean. He ate almost entirely with his knife. I doubt if you could say he had the manners of a gentleman, but he had better than that, a touch of genuine dignity. Was it from his stay in Asia Minor? Was it from a strain in the Finsbury blood, sometimes alluded to by customers? At least, when he presented himself before the station master, his salaam was truly oriental. Palm trees appeared to crowd about the little office, and the samum or the bulbul, but I leave this image to persons better acquainted with the East. His appearance, besides, was highly in his favor. The uniform of Sir Faraday, however inconvenient and conspicuous, was, at least, a costume in which no swindler could have hoped to prosper, and the exhibition of a valuable watch and a bill for £800 completed what the portman had begun. A quarter of an hour later, when the train came up, Mr. Finsbury was introduced a guard and installed in a first-class compartment, the station master smilingly assuming all responsibility. As the old gentleman sat waiting the moment of departure, he was the witness of an incident strangely connected with the fortunes of his house. A packing case of cyclopean bulk was borne along the platform by some dozen of tottering porters, and ultimately, to the delight of a considerable crowd, hoisted on board the van. It is often the cheering task of the historian to direct attention to the designs and, if it may be reverently said, the artifices of Providence. In the luggage van, as Joseph was borne out of the station of Southampton East upon his way to London, the egg of his romance lay, so to speak, unhatched. The huge packing case was directed to lie at Waterloo till called for, and addressed to one William Dent Pitman. And the very next article, a goodly barrel jammed into the corner of the van, bore the superscription, M. Finsbury, 16 John Street, Bloomsbury. Carriage paid. In this juxtaposition, the train of powder was prepared, and there was now wanting only an idle hand to fire it off. Chapter 4. The Magistrate in the Luggage Van. The city of Winchester is famed for a cathedral, a bishop, but he was unfortunately killed some years ago while riding, a public school, a considerable assortment of the military, and a deliberate passage of the trains of the London and South Western Line. These and many similar associations would have doubtless crowded on the mind of Joseph Finsbury, but his spirit had at that time flitted from the railway compartment to a heaven of populous lecture halls and endless oratory. His body, in the meanwhile, lay doubled on the cushions, the forage cap rakishly tilted back after the fashion of those that lie in wait for nursery maids, the poor old face quiescent, one arm clutching to his Hart Lloyd's weekly newspaper. To him, thus unconscious, enter and exit again a pair of voyagers. These two had saved the train, and no more. A tandem urged to its last speed, an act of something closely bordering on brigandage at the ticket office, and a spasm of running, had brought them on the platform just as the engine uttered its departing snort. There was but one carriage easily within their reach, and they had sprung into it, and the leader and elder already had his feet upon the floor, when he observed Mr. Finsbury. "Good God!" he cried. "Uncle Joseph, this'll never do." And he backed out, almost upsetting a companion, and once more closed the door upon the sleeping patriarch. The next moment the pair had jumped into the baggage van. "What's the row about your Uncle Joseph?" inquired the younger traveler, mopping his brow. "Does he object to smoking?" "I don't know that there's anything the row with him," returned the other. "He's by no means a first comer, my Uncle Joseph. I can tell you, very respectable old gentleman. Interested in leather. Been to Asia Minor. No family, no assets. And a tongue, my dear Wickham, sharper than a serpent's tooth." "Cantankerous old party, suggested Wickham. "Not in the least," cried the other. "Only a man with solid talent for being a bore. Rather cheery, I dare say, on a desert island, but on a railway journey insupportable. You should hear him on Tawny, the ass that started Tontines. He's incredible on Tawny." "By Jove!" cried Wickham. "Then you're one of these Finsbury tontine fellows. I hadn't a guess of that." "Ah!" said the other. "Do you know that old boy in the carriage is worth £100,000 to me? There he was asleep, and nobody there but you, but I spared him, because I'm a conservative in politics." Mr. Wickham, pleased to be in a luggage van, was flitting to and fro like a gentlemanly butterfly. "By jingo!" he cried. "Here's something for you. M. Finsbury, 16 John Street, Bloomsbury, London. M. Stand for Michael, you sly dog. You keep two establishments, do you?" "Oh, that's Morris," responded Michael from the other end of the van, where he had found a comfortable seat upon some sacks. "He's a little cousin of mine. I like him myself because he's afraid of me. He's one of the ornaments of Bloomsbury and has a collection of some kind, birds' eggs, or something that's supposed to be curious. I bet it's nothing to my clients." "What a lark it would be to play Billy with the labels," chuckled Mr. Wickham. "By George, here's a tack hammer. We might send all these things skipping about the premises like what's his name." At this moment, the guard, surprised by the sound of voices, opened the door of his little cabin. "You had best step in here, gentlemen," said he, when he had heard their story. "Won't you come, Wickham?" asked Michael. "Catch me. I want to travel in a van," replied the youth. And so the door of communication was closed, and for the rest of the run, Mr. Wickham was left alone over his diversions on the one side, and on the other Michael and the guard were closeted together in familiar talk. "I can get you a compartment here, sir," observed the official, as the train began to slacken speed before Bishopstoke Station. "You had best get out at my door, and I can bring your friend." Mr. Wickham, whom we left, as the reader has shrewdly suspected, beginning to play Billy with the labels in the van, was a young gentleman of much wealth, a pleasing but sandy exterior, and a highly vacant mind. Not many months before, he had contrived to get himself blackmailed by the family of a Wallachian hospodar, resident for political reasons in the gay city of Paris. A common friend, to whom he confided his distress, recommended him to Michael, and the lawyer was no sooner in possession of the facts than he instantly assumed the offensive, fell on the flank of the Wallachian forces, and, in inside of 3 days, had the satisfaction to behold them routed and fleeing for the Danube. It is no business of ours to follow them on this retreat, over which the police were so obliging as to preside paternally. Thus relieved from what he loved to refer to as the Bulgarian atrocity, Mr. Wickham returned to London with the most unbounded and embarrassing gratitude and admiration for his Savior. These sentiments were not repaid either in kind or degree. Indeed, Michael was a trifle ashamed of his new client's friendship. It had taken many invitations to get him to Winchester and Wickham Manor, but he had gone at last and was now returning. It has been remarked by some judicious thinker, possibly J.S. Smith, that Providence despises to employ no instrument, however humble, and it is now plain to the dullest that both Mr. Wickham and the Wallachian hospodar were liquid lead and wedges in the hand of destiny. Smitten with the desire to shine in Michael's eyes and show himself a person of original humor and resources, the young gentleman, who was a magistrate more by token in his native county, was no sooner alone in the van than he fell upon the labels with all the zeal of a reformer, and when he rejoined the lawyer at Bishopstoke, his face was flushed with his exertions, and his cigar, which he had suffered to go out, was almost bitten in two. "By George, but this has been a lark," he cried. "I've sent the wrong thing to everybody in England. These cousins of yours have a packing case as big as a house. I've muddled the whole business up to that extent, Finsbury, that if it were to get out as my belief, we should get lynched." It was useless to be serious with Mr. Wickham. "Take care," said Michael. "I am getting tired of your perpetual scrapes. My reputation is beginning to suffer." "Your reputation will be all gone before you finish with me," replied his companion with a grin. "Clap it in the bill, my boy. For total loss of reputation, 6 and 8 pence. But," continued Mr. Wickham with more seriousness, "could I be bowled out of commission for this little jest? I know it's small, but I like to be a J.P. Speaking as a professional man, do you think there's any risk?" "What does it matter?" responded Michael. "They'll chuck you out sooner or later. Somehow you don't give the effect of being a good magistrate." "I only wish I was solicitor," retorted his companion, "instead of a poor devil of a country gentleman. Suppose we start one of those tontine affairs ourselves. I'd pay $500 a year, and you to guarantee me against every misfortune except illness or marriage." "It strikes me," remarked the lawyer with a meditative laugh, as he lighted a cigar, "it strikes me that you must be a cursed nuisance in this world of ours." "Do you really think so, Finsbury?" responded the magistrate, leaning back in his cushions, delighted with the compliment. "Yes, I suppose I am a nuisance. But, mind you, I have a stake in the country. Don't forget that, dear boy. Chapter 5. Mr. Gideon Forsyth and the Gigantic Box. It has been mentioned that at Bournemouth Julia sometimes made acquaintances. It is true she had but a glimpse of them before the doors of John Street closed again upon its captives, but the glimpse was sometimes exhilarating, and the consequent regret was tempered with hope. Among those whom she had thus met a year before was a young barrister of the name of Gideon Forsyth. About 3 o'clock of the eventful day, when a magistrate tampered with the labels, a somewhat moody and distempered ramble had carried Mr. Forsyth to the corner of John Street, and about the same moment Miss Hazeltine was called to the door of number 16 by a thundering double knock. Mr. Gideon Forsyth was a happy enough young man. He would have been happier if he had had more money and less uncle. £120 a year was all his store, but his uncle, Mr. Edward Hugh Bloomfield, supplemented this with a handsome allowance and a great deal of advice, couched in language that would probably have been judged intemperate on board a pirate ship. Mr. Bloomfield was indeed a figure quite peculiar to the days of Mr. Gladstone, what we may call, for the lack of an accepted expression, a square radical. Having acquired years without experience, he carried into the radical side of politics those noisy, after-dinner-table passions, which we are more accustomed to connect with Toryism in its severe and senile aspects, to the opinions of Mr. Bradlaugh. In fact, he added the temper and the sympathies of that extinct animal, the squire. He admired pugilism. He carried a formidable oaken staff. He was a reverent churchman, and it was hard to know which would have more volcanically stirred his choler, a person who should have defended the established church, or one who should have neglected to attend its celebrations. He had besides some leveling catchwords, justly dreaded in the family circle. And when he could not go so far as to declare a step un-English, he might still, and with hardly less effect, denounce it as unpractical. It was under the ban of this lesser excommunication that Gideon had fallen. His views on the study of law had been pronounced unpractical, and had been intimated to him, in a vociferous interview punctuated with the oaken staff, that he must either take a new start and get a brief or two, or prepare to live on his own money. No wonder if Gideon was moody. He had not the slightest wish to modify his present habits, but he would not stand on that, since the recall of Mr. Bloomfield's allowance would revolutionize them still more radically. He had not the least desire to acquaint himself with law. He had looked into it already, and it seemed not to repay attention, but upon this also he was ready to give way. In fact, he would go as far as he could to meet the views of his uncle, the square radical. But there was one part of the program that appeared independent of his will. How to get a brief. There was the question. And there was another and a worse. Suppose he got one. Should he prove the better man? Suddenly, he found his way barred by a crowd. A garishly illuminated van was backed against the curb. From its open stern, half resting on the street, half supported by some glistening athletes, the end of the largest packing case in the county of Middlesex might have been seen protruding, while, on the steps of the house, the burly person of the driver and the slim figure of a young girl stood as upon a stage, disputing. "It is not for us," the girl was saying. "I beg you to take it away. It couldn't get into the house, even if you managed to get it out of the van. I shall leave it on the pavement, then, and Finsbury can arrange with the vestry as he likes," said the van man. "But I am not Finsbury," expostulated the girl. "It doesn't matter who you are," said the van man. "You must allow me to help you, Miss Hazeltine," said Gideon, putting out his hand. Julia gave a little cry of pleasure. "Oh, Mr. Forsyth," she cried, "I am so glad to see you. We must get this horrid thing, which can only have come here by mistake, into the house. The man says we'll have to take off the door or knock 2 of our windows into one, or be fined by the vestry or custom house, or something for leaving our parcels on the pavement." The men by this time had successfully removed the box from the van, had plumped it down on the pavement, and now stood leaning against it or gazing at the door at number 16, in visible physical distress and mental embarrassment. The windows of the whole street had filled, as if by magic, with interested and entertained spectators. With as thoughtful and scientific an expression as he could assume, Gideon measured the doorway with his cane, while Julia entered his observations in a drawing book. He then measured the box, and, upon comparing his data, found that there was just enough space for it to enter. Next, throwing off his coat and waistcoat, he assisted the men to take the door from its hinges. And lastly, all bystanders being pressed into the service. The packing case mounted the steps upon some 15 pairs of wavering legs, scraped, loudly grinding through the doorway, and was deposited at length with a formidable convulsion in the far end of the lobby which it almost blocked. The artisans of this victory smiled upon each other as the dust subsided. It was true. They had smashed a bust of Apollo and plowed the wall into deep ruts. But at least they were no longer one of the public spectacles of London. "Well, sir," said the van man, "I never see such a job." Gideon eloquently expressed his concurrence in this sentiment by pressing a couple of sovereigns in the man's hand. "Make it 3, sir, and I'll stand Sam to everybody here," cried the latter. And, this having been done, the whole body of volunteer porters swarmed into the van, which drove off in the direction of the nearest reliable public house. Gideon closed the door on their departure and turned to Julia. Their eyes met. The most uncontrollable mirth seized upon them both, and they made the house ring with their laughter. Then curiosity awoke in Julia's mind, and she went and examined the box, and more especially the label. "This is the strangest thing that ever happened," she said, with another burst of laughter. "It is certainly Morris's handwriting, and I had a letter from him only this morning, telling me to expect a barrel. Is there a barrel coming too, do you think, Mr. Forsyth? Statuary with care fragile," read Gideon aloud from the painted warning on the box. "Then you were told nothing about this?" "No," responded Julia. "Oh, Mr. Forsyth, don't you think we might take a peep at it?" "Yes, indeed," cried Gideon. "Just let me have a hammer." "Come down and I'll show you where it is," cried Julia. "The shelf is too high for me to reach." And, opening the door of the kitchen stair, she bade Gideon follow her. They found both a hammer and a chisel. But Gideon was surprised to see no sign of servant. He also discovered that Miss Hazeltine had a very pretty little foot and ankle, and the discovery embarrassed him so much that he was glad to fall at once upon the packing case. He worked hard and earnestly, and dealt his blows with the precision of a blacksmith, Julia the while standing silently by his side, and regarding rather the workman than the work. He was a handsome fellow. She told herself she had never seen such beautiful arms. And suddenly, as though he had overheard these thoughts, Gideon turned and smiled to her. She, too, smiled and colored, and the double change became her so prettily that Gideon forgot to turn away his eyes, and, swinging the hammer with a will, discharged a smashing blow on his own knuckles. With admirable presence of mind, he crushed down an oath and substituted the harmless comment, "Butterfingers." But the pain was sharp, his nerve was shaken, and after an abortive trial, he found he must desist from further operations. In a moment, Julia was off to the pantry. In a moment, she was back again with a basin of water and a sponge, and had begun to bathe his wounded hand. "I am dreadfully sorry," said Gideon apologetically. "If I had had any manners, I should have opened the box first and smashed my hand afterward. It feels much better," he added. "I assure you it does. And now I think you are well enough to direct operations," said she. "Tell me what to do, and I'll be your workman." "A very pretty workman," said Gideon, rather forgetting himself. She turned and looked at him, with a suspicion of a frown, and the indiscreet young man was glad to direct her attention to the packing case. The bulk of the work had been accomplished, and presently Julia had burst through the last barrier and disclosed a zone of straw. In a moment they were kneeling side by side, engaged like haymakers. The next they were rewarded with a glimpse of something white and polished, and the next again laid bare an unmistakable marble leg. "He is surely a very athletic person," said Julia. "I never saw anything like it," responded Gideon. "His muscles stand out like penny rolls." Another leg was soon disclosed, and then what seemed to be a third. This resolved itself, however, into a knotted club resting upon a pedestal. "It is a Hercules," cried Gideon. "I might have guessed that from his calf. I'm supposed to be rather partial to statuary, but when it comes to Hercules, the police should interfere. I should say," he added, glancing with disaffection at the swollen leg, "that this was about the biggest and the worst in Europe. What in heaven's name can have induced him to come here?" "I suppose nobody else would have a gift of him," said Julia. "And for that matter, I think we could have done without the monster very well." "Oh, don't say that," returned Gideon. "This has been one of the most amusing experiences of my life." I don't think you'll forget it very soon, said Julia. Your hand will remind you. Well, I suppose I must be going, said Gideon reluctantly. No, pleaded Julia. Why should you? Stay and have tea with me. If I thought you really wished me to stay, said Gideon, looking at his hat, of course I should only be too delighted. What a silly person you must take me for, returned the girl. Why, of course I do. And besides, I want some cakes for tea and I've nobody to send. Here is the latchkey. Gideon put on his hat with alacrity, and casting one look at Miss Hazeltine and another at the legs of Hercules, to open the door and departed on his errand. He returned with a large bag of the choicest and most tempting of cakes and tartlets, and found Julia in the act of spreading a small tea table in the lobby. The rooms are all in such a state, she cried, that I thought we should be more cozy and comfortable in our own lobby and under our own vine and statuary. Ever so much better, cried Gideon delightedly. Oh, what adorable cream tarts, said Julia, opening the bag, and the dearest little cherry tartlets, with all the cherries spilled out into cream. Yes, said Gideon, concealing his dismay. I knew they would mix beautifully. The woman behind the counter told me so. Now, said Julia, as they began their little festival, I am going to show you Morris's letter. Read it aloud, please. Perhaps there's something I have missed. Gideon took the letter, and spreading it out on his knee, read as follows. Dear Julia, I write you from Browndine, where we are stopping over for a few days. Uncle was much shaken in that dreadful accident, of which, I dare say, you have seen the account. Tomorrow I leave him here with John and come up alone, but before that you will have received a barrel containing specimens for a friend. Do not open it on any account, but leave it in the lobby till I come. Yours in haste, M. Finsbury. P.S. Be sure and leave the barrel in the lobby. No, said Gideon. There seems to be nothing about the monument. And he nodded as he spoke at the marble legs. Miss Hazeltine, he continued, would you mind me asking a few questions? Certainly not, replied Julia. And if you can make me understand why Morris has sent a statue of Hercules instead of a barrel containing specimens for a friend, I shall be grateful till my dying day. And what are specimens for a friend? I haven't a guess, said Gideon. Specimens are usually bits of stone, but rather smaller than our friend the monument. Still, that is not the point. Are you quite alone in this big house? Yes, I am at present, returned Julia. I came up before them to prepare the house and get another servant, but I couldn't get one I liked. Then you are utterly alone, said Gideon in amazement. Are you not afraid? No, responded Julia stoutly. I don't see why I should be more afraid than you would be. I am weaker, of course, but when I found I must sleep alone in a house, I bought a revolver wonderfully cheap and made the man show me how to use it. And how do you use it? Demanded Gideon, much amused at her courage. Why, said she with a smile, you pull a little trigger thing on top, and then pointing it very low, for it springs up as you fire, you pull the underneath little trigger thing, and it goes off as well as if a man had done it. And how often have you used it? Asked Gideon. Oh, I have not used it yet, said the determined young lady. But I know how, and that makes me wonderfully courageous, especially when I barricade my door with a chest of drawers. I'm awfully glad they are coming back soon, said Gideon. This business strikes me as excessively unsafe. If it goes on much longer, I could provide you with a maiden aunt of mine, or my landlady if you preferred. Lend me an aunt, cried Julia. Oh, what generosity! I begin to think it must have been you that sent the Hercules. Believe me, cried the young man, I admire you too much to send you such an infamous work of art. Julia was beginning to reply, when they were both startled by a knocking at the door. Oh, Mr. Forsyth. Don't be afraid, my dear girl, said Gideon, laying his hand tenderly on her arm. I know it's the police, she whispered. They are coming to complain about the statue. The knock was repeated. It was louder than before and more impatient. It's Morris, cried Julia in a startled voice, and she ran to the door and opened it. It was indeed Morris that stood before them. Not the Morris of ordinary days, but a wild-looking fellow, pale and haggard, with bloodshot eyes and a 2 days' beard upon his chin. The barrel, he cried. Where's the barrel that came this morning? And he stared about the lobby, his eyes, as they fell upon the legs of Hercules, literally goggling in his head. "What is that?" he screamed. "What is that waxwork? Speak, you fool! What is that? And where's the barrel, the water butt?" "No barrel came, Morris," responded Julia coldly. "This is the only thing that has arrived." "This!" shrieked the miserable man. "I never heard of it." "It came addressed in your hand," replied Julia. "We had nearly to pull the house down to get it in. That is all that I can tell you." Morris gazed at her in utter bewilderment. He passed his hand over his forehead. He leaned against the wall like a man about to faint. Then his tongue was loosed, and he overwhelmed the girl with torrents of abuse. Such fire, such directness, such a choice of ungentlemanly language, none had ever before suspected Morris to possess. And the girl trembled and shrank before his fury. "You shall not speak to Miss Hazeltine in that way," said Gideon sternly. "It is what I will not suffer." "I shall speak to the girl as I like," returned Morris, with a fresh outburst of anger. "I'll speak to the hussy as she deserves." "Not a word more, sir, not one word," cried Gideon. "Miss Hazeltine," he continued, addressing the young girl, "you cannot stay a moment longer in the same house with this unmanly fellow. Here is my arm. Let me take you where you will be secure from insult." "Mr. Forsyth," returned Julia, "you are right. I cannot stay here longer, and I am sure I trust myself to an honorable gentleman." Pale and resolute, Gideon offered her his arm, and the pair descended the steps, followed by Morris clamoring for the latchkey. Julia had scarcely handed the key to Morris before an empty hansom drove smartly into John Street. It was hailed by both men, and as the cabman drew up his restive horse, Morris made a dash into the vehicle. "Sixpence above fare," he cried recklessly. "Waterloo Station for your life. Sixpence for yourself." "Make a shilling, governor," said the man with a grin. The other parties were first. "A shilling, then," cried Morris, with the inward reflection that he would reconsider it at Waterloo. The man whipped up his horse, and the hansom vanished from John Street. Chapter 6. The Tribulations of Morris. Part the First. As the hansom span through the streets of London, Morris sought to rally the forces of his mind. The water butt with the dead body had miscarried, and it was essential to recover it. So much was clear, and if by some blessed good fortune it was still at the station, all might be well. If it had been sent out, however, if it were already in the hands of some wrong person, matters looked more ominous. People who receive unexplained packages are usually keen to have them open. The example of Miss Hazeltine, whom he cursed again, was there to remind him of the circumstance. And if anyone had opened the water butt, "Oh, Lord!" cried Morris at the thought, and carried his hand to his damp forehead. The private conception of any breach of law is apt to be inspiriting for the scheme, while yet inchoate, wears dashing and attractive colors. Not so in the least that part of the criminal's later reflections which deal with the police. That useful corps, as Morris now began to think, had scarce been kept sufficiently in view when he embarked upon his enterprise. "I must play devilish close," he reflected, and he was aware of an exquisite thrill of fear in the region of the spine. "Main line or loop?" inquired the cabman through the scuttle. "Main line," replied Morris, and mentally decided that the man should have his shilling after all. It would be madness to attract attention, thought he, but what this thing will cost me, first and last, begins to be a nightmare. He passed through the booking office and wandered disconsolately on the platform. It was a breathing space in the day's traffic. There were few people there, and these for the most part quiescent on the benches. Morris seemed to attract no remark, which was a good thing. But, on the other hand, he was making no progress in his quest. Something must be done. Something must be risked. Every passing instant only added to his dangers. Summoning all his courage, he stopped the porter and asked him if he remembered receiving a barrel by the morning train. He was anxious to get information, for the barrel belonged to a friend. "It is a matter of some moment," he added, "for it contains specimens." "I was not here this morning, sir," responded the porter, somewhat reluctantly, "but I'll ask Bill. Do you recollect, Bill, to have got a barrel from Bournemouth this morning containing specimens?" "I don't know about specimens," replied Bill, "but the party has received the barrel. I mean raised a sight of trouble." "What's that?" cried Morris, in the agitation of the moment pressing a penny into the man's hand. "You see, sir, the barrel arrived at 1:30. No one claimed till about 3, when a small, sickly-looking gentleman, probably a curate, came up and says he, 'Have you got anything for Pittman?' Or 'William Ben Pittman,' if I recollect right. 'I don't exactly know,' says I, 'but I rather fancy that their barrel bears that name.' The little man went up to the barrel, and seemed regularly all took aback when he saw the address, and then he pitched into us for not having brought what he wanted. 'I don't care a damn what you want,' says I to him, 'but if you are Willem Ben Pittman, there's your barrel.' 'Well, and did he take it?' cried the breathless Morris. 'Well, sir,' returned Bill, 'it appears it was a packing case he was after. The packing case came. That's sure enough, because it was about the biggest packing case ever I clapped eyes on. And this Pittman, he seemed a good deal cut up, and he had the superintendent out, and they got hold of the van man him as took the packing case. Well, sir,' continued Bill with a smile, 'I never see a man in such a state. Everybody about that van was mortal, bar the horses. Some gentlemen, as well as I could make out, had given the van man a SOV, and so that was where the trouble come in, you see.' 'But what did he say?' gasped Morris. 'I don't know as he said much, sir,' said Bill, 'but he offered to fight this Pittman for a pot of beer. He had lost his book, too, in the receipts, and his men were all as mortal as himself. Oh, they were all like,' and Bill paused for a simile, 'like lords. The superintendent sacked them on the spot.' 'Oh, come, but that's not so bad,' said Morris, with a bursting sigh. 'He couldn't tell where he took the packing case, then?' 'Not he,' said Bill, 'nor yet nothing else.' 'And what did Pittman do?' asked Morris. 'Oh, he went off with the barrel in a four-wheeler, very trembling like,' replied Bill. 'I don't believe he's a gentleman as has good health.' 'Well, so the barrel's gone,' said Morris, half to himself. 'You may depend on that, sir,' returned the porter, 'but you had better see the superintendent.' 'Not in the least. It's of no account,' said Morris. 'It only contains specimens.' And he walked hastily away. Ensconced once more in a hansom, he proceeded to reconsider his position. Suppose, he thought, suppose he should accept defeat and declare his uncle's death at once? He should lose the tontine, and with that the last hope of his £7,800. But on the other hand, since the shilling to the hansom cabman, he had begun to see that crime was expensive in its course, and, since the loss of the water butt, that it was uncertain in its consequences. Quietly at first, and then with growing heat, he reviewed the advantages of backing out. It involved a loss, but, come to think of it, no such great loss after all. Only that of the tontine would have been always a toss-up which at bottom he had never really expected. He reminded himself of that eagerly. He congratulated himself upon his constant moderation. He had never really expected the tontine. He had never even very definitely hoped to recover his £7,800. He had been hurried into the whole thing by Michael's obvious dishonesty. Yes, it would probably be better to draw back from this high-flying venture, settle back on the leather business. "Great God!" cried Morris, bounding in the hansom like a jack-in-the-box. "I have not only not gained the tontine, I have lost the leather business." Such was the monstrous fact. He had no power to sign. He could not draw a check for 30 shillings. Until he could produce legal evidence of his uncle's death, he was a penniless outcast. And as soon as he produced it, he had lost the tontine. There was no hesitation on the part of Morris. To drop the tontine like a hot chestnut, to concentrate all his forces on the leather business and the rest of his small but legitimate inheritance, was a decision of a single instant, and the next, the full extent of his calamity was suddenly disclosed to him. Declare his uncle's death? He couldn't. Since the body was lost, Joseph had, in a legal sense, become immortal. There was no created vehicle big enough to contain Morris and his woes. He paid the hansom off and walked on he knew not whither. "I seem to have gone into this business with too much precipitation," he reflected, with a deadly sigh. "I fear it seems too ramified for a person of my powers of mind." And then a remark of his uncle's flashed into his memory. If you want to think clearly, put it all down on paper. "Well, the old boy knew a thing or two," said Morris. "I will try, but I don't believe the paper was ever made that will clear my mind." He entered a place of public entertainment, ordered bread and cheese and writing materials, and sat down before them heavily. He tried the pen. It was an excellent pen, but what was he to write? "I have it," cried Morris. "Robinson Crusoe and the double columns." He prepared his paper after that classic model and began as follows. "Stop a bit," said Morris. "I am letting the spirit of antithesis run away with me. Let's start again." "Oh, but in that case I go to jail." "I forgot that," thought Morris. "Indeed, I don't know that I had better dwell on that hypothesis at all. It's all very well to talk of facing the worst, but in the case of this kind of man's first duty is to his own nerve. Is there any answer to number 3? Is there any possible good side to such a beastly bungle? There must be, of course, or where would be the use of this double-entry business? And, by George, I have it," he exclaimed. "It's exactly the same as the last." And he hastily rewrote the passage. "This venal doctor seems quite a desideratum," he reflected. "I want him first to give me a certificate that my uncle is dead, so that I may get the leather business, and then that he's alive. But here we are again at the incompatible interests." And he returned to his tabulation. "Oh, this seems to be a very one-sided business," exclaimed Morris. "There's not so much in this method as I was led to think." He crumpled the paper up and threw it down, and then, the next moment, picked it up again and ran over. "It seems it's on a financial point that my position is weakest," he reflected. "Is there positively no way of raising the wind? In a vast city like this, and surrounded by all the resources of civilization, it seems not to be conceived. Let us have no more precipitation. Is there nothing I can sell? My collection of signet." But at the thought of scattering these love treasures, the blood leaped into Morris's cheek. "I would rather die," he exclaimed, and, cramming his hat upon his head, strode forth into the streets. "I must raise funds," he thought. "My uncle being dead, the money in the bank is mine, or would be mine, but for the cursed injustice that has pursued me ever since I was an orphan in a commercial academy. I know what any other man would do, any other man in Christendom would forge. Although I don't know why I call it forging, either when Joseph's dead and funds are my own. When I think of that, when I think that my uncle is really as dead as mutton and that I can't prove it, my gorge rises at the injustice of the whole affair. I used to feel bitterly about that £7,800. It seems a trifle now. Dear me, why, the day before yesterday I was comparatively happy." And Morris stood on the sidewalk and heaved another sobbing sigh. "Then there's another thing," he resumed. "Can I? Am I able? Why didn't I practice different handwritings while I was young? How a fellow regrets those lost opportunities when he grows up. But there's one comfort. It's not morally wrong. I can try it on with clear conscience. And even if I was found out, I wouldn't greatly care, morally, I mean. And then if I succeed and if Pittman is staunch, there's nothing to do but find a venal doctor. And that ought to be simple enough in a place like London. By all accounts, the town's alive with them. It wouldn't do, of course, to advertise for a corrupt physician. That would be impolitic. No, I suppose a fellow has simply to spot along the streets for a red lamp and herbs in the window, and then you go in and put to him plainly, though it seems a delicate step." He was near home now, after many devious wanderings, and turned up John Street. As he thrust his latchkey in the lock, another mortifying reflection struck him to the heart. "Not even this house is mine till I can prove him dead," he snarled, and slammed the door behind him so that the windows in the attic rattled. Night had long fallen. Long ago the lamps in the shop fronts had begun to glitter down the endless streets. The lobby was pitch dark, and as the devil would have it, Morris barked his shins and sprawled all his length over the pedestal of Hercules. The pain was sharp. His temper was already thoroughly undermined. By a last misfortune his hand closed on a hammer as he fell, and in a spasm of childish irritation, he turned and struck at the offending statue. There was a splintering crash. "Oh, Lord, what have I done next?" wailed Morris, and he groped his way to find a candle. "Yes," he reflected, as he stood with the light in his hand and looked upon the mutilated leg, from which about a pound of muscle was detached. "Yes, I have destroyed a genuine antique. I may be in for thousands." And then there sprung up in his bosom a sort of angry hope. "Let me see," he thought. "Julia's got rid of. There's nothing connect me with that beast Forsyth. The men were all drunk, And what's better, they've been all discharged. Oh, come, I think this is another case of moral courage. I'll deny all knowledge of the thing. A moment more, and he stood again before the Hercules, his lips sternly compressed, the coal axe and the meat cleaver under his arm. The next, he had fallen upon the packing case. This had been already seriously undermined by the operations of Gideon. A few well-directed blows, and already quaked and gaped. Yet a few more, and it fell about Morris in a shower of boards, followed by an avalanche of straw. And now the leather merchant could behold the nature of his task, and at the first sight his spirit quailed. It was indeed no more ambitious a task for the Lesseps, with all his men and horses, to attack the hills of Panama, than for a single, slim young gentleman, with no previous experience of labor in a quarry, to measure himself against that bloated monster on his pedestal. And yet the pair were well encountered. On the one side, bulk; on the other, genuine heroic fire. "Down you shall come, you great big, ugly brute," cried Morris aloud, with something of that passion which swept the Parisian mob against the walls of the Bastille. "Down you shall come this night. I'll have none of you in my lobby." The face, from its indecent expression, had particularly animated the zeal of our iconoclast, and it was against the face that he began his operations. The great height of the demigod, for he stood a fathom and a half in his stocking feet, offered a preliminary obstacle to this attack. But here, in the first skirmish of the battle, intellect already began to triumph over matter. By means of a pair of library steps, the injured householder gained a posture of advantage, and, with great swipes of the coal-axe, proceeded to decapitate the brute. 2 hours later, what had been the erect image of a gigantic coal porter turned miraculously white, was now no more than a medley of disjected members, the quadragenarian torso prone against the pedestal, the lascivious countenance leering down the kitchen stair, the legs, the arms, the hands, and even the fingers scattered broadcast on the lobby floor. Half an hour more, and all the debris had been laboriously carted to the kitchen, and Morris, with a gentle sentiment of triumph, looked round upon the scene of his achievements. Yes, he could deny all knowledge of it now. The lobby, beyond the fact that it was partly ruinous, betrayed no trace of the passage of Hercules. But it was a weary Morris that crept up to bed. His arms and shoulders ached. The palms of his hands burned from the rough kisses of the coal-axe, and there was one smarting finger that stole continually to his mouth. Sleep long delayed to visit the dilapidated hero, and with the first peep of day it had again deserted him. The morning, as though to accord with his disastrous fortunes, dawned inclemently. An easterly gale was shouting in the streets. Flaws of rain angrily assailed the windows, and as Morris dressed, the draught from the fireplace vividly played about his legs. I think, he could not help observing bitterly, that with all I had to bear, they might have given me decent weather. There was no bread in the house, for Miss Hazeltine, like all women left of themselves, had subsisted entirely upon cake. But some of this was found, and, along with what the poets call a glass of fair, cold water, made up a semblance of morning meal, and then down he sat undauntedly to his delicate task. Nothing can be more interesting than the study of signatures, written, as they are, before meals and after, during indigestion and intoxication. Written when the signer is trembling for the life of his child, or has come from winning the Derby, in his lawyer's office, or under the bright eyes of his sweetheart. To the vulgar, these seem never the same, but to the expert, the bank clerk, or the lithographer, they are constant quantities, and as recognizable as the North Star to the night watch on deck. To all this Morris was alive. In the theory of that graceful art in which he was now embarking, our spirited leather merchant was beyond all reproach. But, happily for the investor, forgery is an affair of practice, and as Morris sat surrounded by examples of his uncle's signature and of his own incompetence, insidious depression stole upon his spirits. From time to time the wind weathered in the chimney at his back. From time to time there swept over Bloomsbury a squall so dark that he must rise and light the gas. About him was a chill and the mean disorder of a house out of commission. The floor bare, the sofa heaped with books and accounts enveloped in a dirty tablecloth, the pens rusted, the paper glazed with a thick film of dust. And yet these were but adminicles of misery, and the true root of his depression lay round him on the table, in the shape of misbegotten forgeries. "It's one of the strangest things I ever heard of," he complained. "It almost seems as if it was a talent that I didn't possess." He went once more minutely through his proofs. A clerk would simply jibe at them, said he. Well, there's nothing else but tracing possible. He waited till a squall had passed, and there came a blink of scowling daylight. Then he went to the window, and in the face of all John Street traced his uncle's signature. It was a poor thing at the best. But it must do, said he, as he stood gazing woefully on his handiwork. He's dead, anyway. And he filled up the check for a couple of hundred and sallied forth for the Anglo-Patagonian Bank. There, at the desk at which he was accustomed to transact business, and with as much indifference as he could assume, Morris presented a forged check to the big, red-bearded Scots teller. The teller seemed to view it with surprise, and as he turned it this way and that, and even scrutinized the signature with a magnifying glass, his surprise appeared to warm into disfavor. Begging to be excused for a moment, he passed away into the rearmost quarters of the bank, whence, after an appreciable interval, he returned again in earnest talk with a superior, an oldish and a baldish, but a very gentlemanly man. Mr. Morris Finsbury, I believe, said the gentlemanly man, fixing Morris with a pair of double eyeglasses. That is my name, said Morris, quavering. Is there anything wrong? Well, the fact is, Mr. Finsbury, you see we are rather surprised at receiving this, said the other, flicking at the check. There are no effects. No effects? Cried Morris. Why, I know myself there must be £8,200, if there's a penny. 2764, I think, replied the gentlemanly man, but it was drawn yesterday. Drawn, cried Morris. By your uncle himself, sir, continued the other. Not only that, but we discounted a bill for him for, let me see, how much was it for, Mr. Bell? 800, Mr. Judkin, replied the teller. Bent Pittman, cried Morris, staggering back. I beg your pardon, said Mr. Judkin. It's only an expletive, said Morris. I hope there's nothing wrong, Mr. Finsbury, said Mr. Bell. All I can tell you, said Morris with a harsh laugh, is that the whole thing's impossible. My uncle is at Bournemouth, unable to move. Really? Cried Mr. Bell, and he recovered a check from Mr. Judkin. But this check is dated in London, and today he observed. How d'ye account for that, sir? Oh, that was a mistake, said Morris, and a deep tide of color dyed his face and neck. No doubt, said Mr. Judkin, but he looked at his customer inquiringly. And, resumed Morris, even if there were no effects, this is a very trifling sum overdraw. Our firm, the name of Finsbury, is surely good enough for such a wretched sum as this. No doubt, Mr. Finsbury, returned Mr. Judkin, and if you insist I will take it into consideration, but I hardly think. In short, Mr. Finsbury, if there had been nothing else, the signature seems hardly all that we could wish. That's of no consequence, replied Morris nervously. I'll get my uncle to sign another. The fact is, he went on with a bold stroke, my uncle is so far from well at present that he was unable to sign this check without assistance, and I fear that my holding the pen for him may have made the difference in the signature. Mr. Judkin shot a keen glance into Morris's face, and then turned and looked at Mr. Bell. Well, he said, it seems as if we had been victimized by a swindler. Pray tell Mr. Finsbury. We shall put detectives on at once. As for this check of yours, I regret that, owing to the way it was signed, the bank can hardly consider it, what shall I say, businesslike. And he returned the check across the counter. Morris took it up mechanically. He was thinking of something very different. In a case of this kind, he began, I believe the loss falls on us. I mean upon my uncle and myself. It does not, sir, replied Mr. Bell. The bank is responsible, and the bank will either recover the money or refund it. You may depend on that. Morris's face fell. Then it was visited by another gleam of hope. I'll tell you what, he said, you leave this entirely in my hands. I'll sift the matter. I've an idea at any rate, and detectives, he added appealingly, are so expensive. The bank would not hear of it, returned Mr. Judkin. The bank stands to lose between £3,000 and £4,000. It will spend as much more if necessary. An undiscovered forger is a permanent danger. We shall clear it up to the bottom, Mr. Finsbury. Set your mind at rest on that. Then I'll stand the loss, said Morris boldly. I order you to abandon the search. He was determined that no inquiry should be made. I beg your pardon, returned Mr. Judkin, but we have nothing to do with you in this matter, which is one between your uncle and ourselves, if he should take this opinion, and will either come here himself or let me see him in his sick room. Quite impossible, cried Morris. Well, then you see, said Mr. Judkin, how my hands are tied. The whole affair must go at once into the hands of police. Morris mechanically folded the check and restored it to his pocket book. Good morning, said he, and scrambled somehow out of the bank. I don't know what they suspect, he reflected. I can't make them out. Their whole behavior is thoroughly unbusinesslike. But it doesn't matter. All's up with everything. The money has been paid. The police are on the scent. In 2 hours, that idiot Pittman will be nabbed, and the whole story of the dead body in the evening papers. If he could have heard what passed in the bank after his departure, he would have been less alarmed, perhaps more mortified. That was a curious affair, Mr. Bell, said Mr. Judkin. Yes, sir, said Mr. Bell, but I think we have given him a fright. Oh, we shall hear no more of Mr. Morris Finsbury, returned the other. It was a first attempt, and the house have dealt with us so long that I was anxious to deal gently. But I suppose, Mr. Bell, there can be no mistake about yesterday? It was old Mr. Finsbury himself. There could be no possible doubt of that, said Mr. Bell with a chuckle. He explained to me the principles of banking. Well, said Mr. Judkin. The next time he calls, ask him to step into my room. It is only proper he should be warned. Chapter 7, in which William Dent Pittman takes legal advice. Norfolk Street, King's Road, jocularly known among Mr. Pittman's lodgers as Norfolk Island, is neither a handsome, nor a pleasing thoroughfare. Dirty, undersized maids of all work issue from it in pursuit of beer, or linger on its sidewalk listening to the voice of love. The cat's meat man passes twice a day. An occasional organ grinder wanders in and wanders out again disgusted. In holiday time the street is the arena of the young bloods of the neighborhood, and the householders have an opportunity of studying the manly art of self-defense. And yet Norfolk Street has one claim to be respectable, for it contains not a single shop, unless you count the public house at the corner, which is really in the King's Road. The door of number 7 bore a brass plate inscribed with the legend W.D. Pittman, artist. It was not a particularly clean brass plate, nor was number 7 itself a particularly inviting place of residence. And yet it had a character of its own, such as may well quicken the pulse of the reader's curiosity. For here was a home of an artist, and a distinguished artist too, highly distinguished by his ill success, which had never been made the subject of an article in the illustrated magazines. No wood engraver had ever reproduced a corner in the back drawing room or the studio mantelpiece of number 7. No young lady author had ever commented on the unaffected simplicity with which Mr. Pittman received her in the midst of his treasures. It is an omission I would gladly supply, but our business is only with the backward parts and abject rear of this aesthetic dwelling. Here was a garden, boasting a dwarf fountain that never played. In the center, a few grimy-looking flowers in pots, 2 or 3 newly planted trees which the spring at Chelsea visited without noticeable consequence, and 2 or 3 statues after the antique, representing satyrs and nymphs in the worst possible style of sculptured art. On one side the garden was overshadowed by a pair of crazy studios, usually hired out to more obscure and youthful practitioners of British art. Opposite these another lofty outbuilding, somewhat more carefully finished, and boasting of a communication with the house, and a private door on the back lane, enshrined the multifarious industry of Mr. Pittman. All day, it is true, he was engaged in the work of education at a seminary for young ladies, but the evenings at least were his own, and these he would prolong far into the night, now dashing off a landscape with waterfall in oil, now a volunteer bust in marble, as he would gently but proudly observe, of some public character, now stooping his chisel to a mere nymph for a gas bracket on a stair, sir, or a life-size infant Samuel for a religious nursery. Mr. Pittman had studied in Paris, and he had studied in Rome, supplied with funds by a fond parent who went subsequently bankrupt in consequence of fall in corsets, and though he was never thought to have the smallest modicum of talent, it was at one time supposed that he had learned his business. 18 years of what is called tuition had relieved him of the dangerous knowledge. His artist lodgers would sometimes reason with him. They would point out to him how impossible it was to paint by gaslight, or to sculpture life-size nymphs without a model. I know that, he would reply. No one in Norfolk Street knows it better. And if I were rich, I should certainly employ the best models in London. But being poor, I have taught myself to do without them. An occasional model would only disturb my ideal conception of the figure and be a positive impediment in my career. As for painting by an artificial light, he would continue, that is simply a knack I have found it necessary to acquire, my days being engrossed in the work of tuition. At the moment when we must present him to our readers, Pittman was in his studio alone, by the dying light of the October day. He sat, sure enough, with unaffected simplicity, in a Windsor chair, his low-crowned black felt hat by his side, a dark, weak, harmless, pathetic little man, clad in the hue of mourning, his coat longer than is usual with the laity, his neck enclosed in a collar without a parting, his neckcloth pale in hue and simply tied, the whole outward man, except for a pointed beard, tentatively clerical. There was a thinning on the top of Pittman's head. There were silver hairs at Pittman's temple. Poor gentleman, he was no longer young, and years and poverty and humble ambition thwarted make a cheerless lot. In front of him, in the corner by the door, there stood a portly barrel, and let him turn them where he might, it was always the barrel that his eyes and his thoughts returned. Should I open it? Should I return it? Should I communicate with Mr. Cernatopoulos at once? He wondered. No, he concluded finally, nothing without Mr. Finsbury's advice. And he arose and produced a shabby leathern desk. It opened without the formality of unlocking, and displayed the thick cream-colored notepaper on which Mr. Pittman was in the habit of communicating with the proprietors of schools and the parents of his pupils. He placed the desk on the table by the window, and taking a saucer of Indian ink from the chimney-piece, laboriously composed the following letter. My dear Mr. Finsbury, it ran, would it be presuming on your kindness if I asked you to pay me a visit here this evening? It is in no trifling matter that I invoke your valuable assistance. For need I say more than it concerns the welfare of Mr. Cernatopoulos' statue of Hercules? I write you in great agitation of mind, for I have made all inquiries, and greatly fear that this work of ancient art has been mislaid. I labor besides under another perplexity, not unconnected with the first. Pray excuse the inelegance of this scrawl, and believe me yours in haste, William D. Pittman. Armed with this, he set forth and rang the bell of number 233 King's Road, the private residence of Michael Finsbury. He had met the lawyer at a time of great public excitement in Chelsea. Michael, who had a sense of humor and a great deal of careless kindness in his nature, followed the acquaintance up, and, having come a laugh, remained to drop into a contemptuous kind of friendship. By this time, which was 4 years after the first meeting, Pittman was the lawyer's dog. No, said the elderly housekeeper, who opened the door in person. Mr. Michael's not in yet, but you're looking terribly poorly, Mr. Pittman. Take a glass of sherry, sir, to cheer ye up. No, I thank you, ma'am, replied the artist. It is very good in you, but I scarcely feel in sufficient spirits for sherry. Just give Mr. Finsbury this note, and ask him to look round. To the door in the lane. You will please tell him I shall be in the studio all evening. And he turned again into the street and walked slowly homeward. A hairdresser's window caught his attention, and he stared long and earnestly at the proud, high-born waxen lady in evening dress, who circulated in the center of the show. The artist woke in him, in spite of his troubles. It is all very well to run down the men who make these things, he cried. But there's a haughty, indefinable something about that figure. It's what I tried for my Empress Eugenie, he added, with a sigh. And he went home reflecting on the quality. They don't teach you that direct appeal in Paris, he thought. It's British. Come, I'm going to sleep. I must wake up. I must aim higher, cried the little artist himself. All through his tea and afterward, as he was giving his eldest boy a lesson on the fiddle, his mind dwelt no longer on his troubles, but he was rapt into the better land. And no sooner was he at liberty than he hastened with positive exhilaration to his studio. Not even the sight of the barrel could entirely cast him down. He flung himself with rising zest into his work, a bust of Mr. Gladstone from a photograph, turned, with extraordinary success, the difficulty of the back of the head, for which he had no documents beyond a hazy recollection of a public meeting, delighted himself by his treatment of the collar, and was only recalled to cares of life by Michael Finsbury's rattle at the door. "Well, what's wrong?" said Michael, advancing to grate, where, knowing his friend's delight in a bright fire, Mr. Pittman had not spared the fuel. "I suppose you've come to grief somehow." "There is no expression strong enough," said the artist. "Mr. Semitopoulos' statue is not turned up, and I am afraid I shall be answerable for the money. But I think nothing of that. What I fear, my dear Mr. Finsbury, what I fear, alas that I should have to say it, is exposure. The Hercules was to be smuggled out of Italy. A thing positively wrong. A thing of which a man of my principles and in my responsible position should have taken, as I now see too late, no part whatever." "This sounds like very serious work," said the lawyer. "It will require a great deal of drink, Pittman. I took the liberty in short, of being prepared for you," replied the artist, pointing to a kettle, a bottle of gin, a lemon, and glasses. Michael mixed himself a grog and offered the artist a cigar. "No, thank you," said Pittman. "I use occasionally to be rather partial to it, but the smell is so disagreeable about the clothes." "All right," said the lawyer. "I am comfortable now. Unfold your tale." At some length Pittman set forth his sorrows. He had gone today to Waterloo, expecting to receive the colossal Hercules, and had received instead a barrel not big enough to hold Discobolus. Yet the barrel was addressed in the hand, with which he was perfectly acquainted, of his Roman correspondent. What was stranger still, a case had arrived by the same train, large enough and heavy enough to contain the Hercules, and this case had been taken to an address now undiscoverable. The van man, I regret to say it, had been drinking, and his language was such as I could never bring myself to repeat. He was at once discharged by the superintendent of the line, who behaved most properly throughout, and is to make inquiries at Southampton. In the meanwhile, what was I to do? I left my address and brought the barrel home, but, remembering an old adage, I determined not to open it except in the presence of my lawyer. "Is that all?" asked Michael. "I don't see any cause to worry. The Hercules has stuck upon the road. It will drop in tomorrow or the day after, and as for the barrel, depend upon it, it's a testimonial from one of your young ladies, and probably contains oysters." "Oh, don't speak so loud," cried the little artist. "It would cost me my place if I were heard to speak lightly of the young ladies. And besides, why oysters from Italy? And why should they come to me addressed in Signor Riccardi's hand?" "Well, let's have a look at it," said Michael. "Let's roll it forward to the light." The two men rolled the barrel from the corner and stood it on end before the fire. "It's heavy enough to be oysters," remarked Michael judiciously. "Shall we open at once?" inquired the artist, who had grown decidedly cheerful under the combined effect of company and gin, and without waiting for a reply, he began to strip as if for a prize fight, tossed his clerical collar in the waste-paper basket, hung his clerical coat upon a nail, and with a chisel in one hand and a hammer in the other, struck the first blow of the evening. "That's the style. William Dent," cried Michael. "There's fire for your money. It may be a romantic visit from one of the young ladies, a sort of Cleopatra business. Have a care and don't stave in Cleopatra's head." But the sight of Pittman's alacrity was infectious. The lawyer could sit still no longer. Tossing his cigar into the fire, he snatched the instrument from the unwilling hand of the artist and fell to himself. Soon the sweat stood in beads upon his large, fair brow. His stylish trousers were defaced with iron rust, and the state of his chisel testified to misdirected energies. A cask is not an easy thing to open, even when you set about it in the right way. When you set about it wrongly, the whole structure must be resolved into its elements. Such was the course pursued alike by the artist and the lawyer. Presently the last hoop had been removed. A couple of smart blows tumbled the staves upon the ground, and what had once been a barrel was no more than a confused heap of broken and distorted boards. In the midst of these, a certain dismal something, swathed in blankets, remained for an instant upright, and then toppled to one side and heavily collapsed before the fire. Even as the thing subsided, an eyeglass tingled to the floor and rolled toward the screaming Pittman. "Hold your tongue," said Michael. He dashed to the house door and locked it. Then, with a pale face and bitten lip, he drew near, pulled aside a corner of the swathing blanket, and recoiled, shuddering. There was a long silence in the studio. "Now tell me," said Michael in a low voice, "had you any hand in it?" and he pointed to the body. The little artist could only utter broken and disjointed sounds. Michael poured some gin into a glass. "Drink that," he said. "Don't be afraid of me. I'm your friend through thick and thin." Pittman put the liquor down untasted. "I swear before God," he said, "this is another mystery to me. In my worst fears, I never dreamed of such a thing. I would not lay a finger on a sucking infant." "That's all square," said Michael with a sigh of huge relief. "I believe you, old boy." And he shook the artist warmly by the hand. "I thought for a moment," he added with rather a ghastly smile, "I thought for a moment you might have made away with Mr. Semitopoulos." "It would make no difference if I had," groaned Pittman. "All is at an end for me. There's a writing on the wall." "To begin with," said Michael, "let's get him out of sight. For to be quite plain with you, Pittman, I don't like your friend's appearance." And with that the lawyer shuddered. "Where can we put it?" "You might put it in the closet there, if you could bear to touch it," answered the artist. "Somebody has to do it, Pittman," returned the lawyer, "and it seems as if it had to be me. You go over to the table, turn your back, and mix me a grog. That's a fair division of labor." About 90 seconds later the closet door was heard to shut. "There," observed Michael, "that's more homelike. You can turn now, my pallid Pittman. Is this the grog?" He ran on. "Heaven forgive you, it's a lemonade. But, oh, Finsbury, what are we to do with it?" wailed the artist, laying a clutching hand upon the lawyer's arm. "Do with it," repeated Michael. "Bury it in one of your flower beds, and erect one of your own statues for a monument. I tell you we should look devilish romantic, shoveling out the sod by the moon's pale ray. Here, put some gin in this. I beg of you, Mr. Finsbury, do not trifle with my misery," cried Pittman. "You see before you a man who has been all his life, I do not hesitate to say it, eminently respectable. Even in this solemn hour I can lay my hand upon my heart without a blush, except on the really trifling point of the smuggling of the Hercules, and even of that I now humbly repent. My life has been entirely fit for publication. I never feared the light," cried the little man, "and now. "Cheer up, old boy," said Michael. "I assure you we should count this little contretemps a trifle at the office. It's the sort of thing that may occur to anyone. And if you're perfectly sure you had no hand in it—" "What language am I to find?" began Pittman. "Oh, I'll do that part of it," interrupted Michael. "You have no experience. But the point is this. Since you know nothing of the crime, since the party in the closet is neither your father, nor your brother, nor your creditor, nor your mother-in-law, nor what they call an injured husband—" "Oh, my dear sir," interjected Pittman, horrified. "Since, in short," continued the lawyer, "you had no possible interest in the crime, we have a perfectly free field before us and a safe game to play. Indeed, the problem is really entertaining. It is one I have long contemplated in the light of an A.B. case. Here it is at last under my hand in specie, and I mean to pull you through. Do you hear that? I mean to pull you through. Let me see. It's a long time since I've had what I call a genuine holiday. I'll send an excuse tomorrow to the office. We had best be lively," he added significantly, "for we must not spoil the market for the other man." "What do you mean?" inquired Pittman. "What other man?" "The inspector police." "Damn the inspector police," remarked his companion. "If you won't take the short cut and bury this in your back garden, we must find someone who will bury it in his. We must place the affair, in short, in the hands of someone with fewer scruples and more resources." "A private detective, perhaps?" suggested Pittman. "There are times when you fill me with pity," observed the lawyer. "By the way, Pittman," he added in another key, "I have always regretted that you have no piano in this den of yours. Even if you don't play yourself, your friends might like to entertain themselves with a little music while you were mudding." "I shall get one at once if you like," said Pittman nervously, anxious to please. "I play the fiddle a little as it is." "I know you do," said Michael. "But what's the fiddle above all as you play it? What you want is polyphonic music. And I'll tell you what it is. Since it's too late for you to buy a piano, I'll give you mine." "Thank you," said the artist blankly. "You will give me yours? I am sure it's very good in you." "Yes, I'll give you mine," continued Michael, for the inspector of police to play on while his men are digging up your back garden. Pittman stared at him in pained amazement. No, I'm not insane, Michael went on. I'm playful, but quite coherent. See here, Pittman. Follow me 1/2 minute. I mean to profit by the refreshing fact that we are really and truly innocent. Nothing but the presence of the, you know what, connects us with the crime. Once let's get rid of it, no matter how. And there is no possible clue to trace us by. Well, I give you my piano. We'll bring it round this very night. Tomorrow we rip the fittings out, deposit our friend inside, plump a hole on a cart, and carry it to the chambers of a young gentleman whom I know by sight. Whom do you know by sight? Repeated Pittman. And what is more to the purpose, continued Michael, whose chambers I know better than he does himself. A friend of mine, I call him my friend for brevity. He is now, I understand, in Demerara and most likely in jail, was a previous occupant. I defended him, and I got him off too, all save but honor. His assets were nil, but he gave me what he had, poor gentleman, and along with the rest, the key of his chambers. It's there that I propose to leave the piano and, shall we say, Cleopatra? It seems very wild, said Pittman. And what will become of the poor young gentleman whom you know by sight? It will do him good, said Michael cheerily. Just what he wants to steady him. But, my dear sir, he might be involved in a charge of murder, gulped the artist. Well, he'll be just where we are, returned the lawyer. He's innocent, you see. What hangs people, my dear Pittman, is the unfortunate circumstance of guilt. But indeed, pleaded Pittman, the whole scheme appears to me so wild. Would it not be safer, after all, just to send for police? And make a scandal? Inquired Michael. The Chelsea mystery, alleged innocence of Pittman? How would that do at the seminary? It would imply my discharge, admitted the drawing master. I cannot deny that. And besides, said Michael, I am not going to embark in such a business and have no fun for my money. Oh, my dear sir, is that a proper spirit? Cried Pittman. Oh, I only said that to cheer you up, said the unabashed Michael. Nothing like a little judicious levity, but it's quite needless to discuss. If you mean to follow my advice, come on, and let us get the piano at once. If you don't, just drop me the word, and I'll leave you to deal with the whole thing according to your better judgment. You know perfectly well that I depend on you entirely, returned Pittman. But oh, what a night is before me with that horror in my studio. How am I to think of it on my pillow? Well, you know, my piano will be there too, said Michael. That'll raise the average. An hour later, a cart came up the lane, and the lawyer's piano, a momentous Broadwood grand, was deposited in Mr. Pittman's studio. Chapter 8, in which Michael Finsbury enjoys a holiday. Punctually at 8 o'clock next morning, the lawyer rattled, according to previous appointment, on the studio door. He found the artist sadly altered for the worse, bleached, bloodshot, and chalky, a man upon wires. The tale is haggard, I still wandering to the closet. Nor was the professor drawing less inclined to wonder at his friend. Michael was usually attired in the height of fashion, with a certain mercantile brilliancy best described perhaps as stylish. Nor could anything be said against him, as a rule, but that he looked a trifle too like a wedding guest to be quite a gentleman. Today, he had fallen altogether from these heights. He wore a flannel shirt of washed-out shepherd's tartan and a suit of reddish tweeds of the color known to tailors as heather mixture. His neckcloth was black and tied loosely in a sailor's knot. A rusty ulster partly concealed these advantages, and his feet were shod with rough walking boots. His hat was an old soft felt, which he removed with a flourish as he entered. "Here I am, William Dent," he cried, and drawing from his pocket 2 little wisps of reddish hair, he held them to his cheeks like side whiskers and danced about the studio with the filmy graces of a ballet girl. Pittman laughed sadly. "I should never have known you," said he. "Nor were you intended to," returned Michael, replacing his false whiskers in his pocket. "Now we must overhaul you in your wardrobe and disguise you up to the nines." "Disguise!" cried the artist. "Must I indeed disguise myself? Has it come to that?" "My dear creature," returned his companion, "disguise is the spice of life." "What is life?" passionately exclaimed a French philosopher, "without the pleasures of disguise?" I don't say it's always good taste, and I know it's unprofessional. But what's the odds? Downhearted drawing master? It has to be. We have to leave a false impression on the minds of many persons, and in particular on the mind of Mr. Gideon Forsyth, the young gentleman I know by sight, if he should have the bad taste to be at home. If he be at home, faltered the artist, that would be the end of all. Won't matter, A.D., returned Michael airily. Let me see your clothes, and I'll make a new man of you in a jiffy. In the bedroom, to which he was at once conducted, Michael examined Pittman's poor and scanty wardrobe with a humorous eye, picked out a short jacket of black alpaca, and presently added to that a pair of summer trousers, which somehow took his fancy as incongruous. Then, with the garments in his hand, he scrutinized the artist closely. I don't like that clerical collar, he remarked. Have you nothing else? The professor, drawing, pondered for a moment, and then brightened. I have a pair of low-neck shirts, he said, that I used to wear in Paris as a student. They are rather loud. The very thing, ejaculated Michael. You look perfectly beastly. Here are spats, too, he continued, drawing forth a pair of those offensive little gaiters. Must have spats. And now you jump into these and whistle a tune at the window for, say, 3/4 an hour. After that you can rejoin me on the field of glory. So saying, Michael returned to the studio. It was the morning of the easterly gale. The wind blew shrilly among the statues in the garden and drove the rain upon the skylight in the studio ceiling. And at about the same moment of the time when Morris attacked the 100th version of his uncle's signature in Bloomsbury, Michael, in Chelsea, began to rip the wires out of the Broadwood Grand.